Well, hello there, my friend. I'm really glad you found your way back to this quiet little corner of the internet again tonight. Go ahead and get yourself comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little higher, let your shoulders drop, and let the noise of today fade out for a while. Because tonight we're travelling somewhere far away and somewhere very old. In the final cold weeks of the year 1347, a handful of ships drifted slowly toward a harbour on the island of Sicily, and something about them was deeply wrong. No sailors called out from the decks, no ropes were thrown to the dock, and when a few brave men finally rowed out to look closer, what waited for them below deck was something the world had never truly faced before. A sickness so quiet and so patient, it would go on to erase more human lives than almost anything else in recorded history. Now, before we step any further into tonight's story, if you enjoy this kind of slow, honest history, it would mean a lot to me if you tapped that subscribe button and maybe left a small like on this video or even a comment down below. I do read every single one. So tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it where you are right now? I love knowing who is out there in the quiet with me. And now go ahead, turn the lights down as low as feels comfortable. Maybe switch on a fan or something with a soft, steady hum in the background. Get yourself settled in one more time and let's begin. Long before anyone in Europe had ever heard the words Black Death, there was a small, busy trading city on the edge of the Black Sea called Kaffa. It sat exactly where east met west, tucked into the coastline of the Crimean Peninsula, in a spot so useful for trade that merchants from the Italian city of Genoa had built an entire life around it. Ships came and went, constantly loaded with silk spices, grain, and precious stones, all of it flowing between two enormous worlds that otherwise rarely touched at all. Kaffa was not a place built for war. It was a place built for business. Genoese families had lived there for generations, doing what merchants have always done best, buying low, selling high, and mostly staying out of everyone else's way. Picture the harbour on an ordinary afternoon, fishermen mending nets along the stone quay, children chasing each other between stacked barrels of grain, the smell of salt water mixing with cardamom and cinnamon drifting up from an open cargo hold, bells from a small chapel marking the hour. None of it looked like the opening scene of a catastrophe. It looked simply like life. But in the winter of 1343 that peace broke apart. A quarrel in a nearby town turned violent, a man was killed, and the ruler of the Golden Horde, a Mongol leader named Jani Beg, decided the Genoese merchants would answer for it. He marched his army to the gates of Kaffa, and he did not plan on leaving until the city surrendered. Sieges in the 14th century were rarely fast affairs, and this one dragged on for years on and off. Kaffa had one enormous advantage though. It sat right on the water, which meant that even while thousands of Mongol soldiers camped outside its walls, ships could still slip in from Italy with food weapons and fresh soldiers. The city held on through 1343, through 1344, and into 1345, and that is when something happened that nobody on either side of those walls could have predicted. Outside the walls, in the sprawling Mongol camp, men began to fall ill. At first it might have looked like nothing unusual. Soldiers get sick, especially when they're crowded together in makeshift tents through a long siege. But this was different. Survivors would later describe painful swollen lumps rising in the armpits and along the neck. Fevers that would not break no matter what anyone tried. Men who were laughing around a campfire one evening and simply gone by morning. We now know, with the benefit of modern science, exactly what was moving silently through that camp. A tiny bacteria carried by fleas which lived on the black rats that travelled everywhere. Merchants and soldiers went hidden in grain sacks, bedding, and the folds of old cloth. Nobody in the year 1345 understood any of that, of course. To them this was simply a curse, a punishment, a shadow moving from tent to tent with no reasoning behind it, and absolutely no way to stop it. Rumours spread faster than the sickness itself, which is usually how these things go. Some soldiers whispered that the enemy had poisoned the wells. Others thought the stars themselves had turned against them. A camp full of grown men, some of the fiercest warriors of their generation, quietly terrified of something they could not fight with a sword. Within weeks, Jani Beg's army was falling apart not from Genoese arrows, but from something his own soldiers could not even see. Here is where the story gets a little complicated, and I think it deserves to be told honestly because history is often messier and far more interesting than the simple version most of us grew up hearing. A notary from the Italian city of Piacenza, a man named Gabriele de Mussi, later wrote down an account of what supposedly happened next. According to him, the Mongol commanders, watching their own army collapse around them, made one final desperate decision. They loaded the bodies of their plague dead onto their siege catapults and hurled them one after another over the walls of Kaffa. It is a chilling image, and some historians even call it one of the earliest recorded attempts at biological warfare in human history. But here is the honest part. Gabriele de Mussi was never actually at Kaffa. He wrote his account afterward, most likely repeating stories he had heard second-hand or even third-hand from frightened refugees scattering across the Mediterranean. And when modern historians look closely at his version of events, quite a bit of it does not fully hold together. Soldiers of that era were not exactly eager to touch the bodies of plague victims, let alone load them by hand onto heavy war machines. And more importantly, most researchers today believe the disease almost certainly did not need any catapults at all. It had already slipped quietly through the gates on its own, hidden in the fur of a few rats and the bite of a few fleas riding along in the same grain sacks and supply carts that had been crossing back and forth between the camp and the city for months long, before anyone ever thought to fling a single body over a wall. Sometimes the true story is smaller and quieter than the legend, and somehow that makes it even more unsettling. Because if there is one thing history keeps teaching us again and again, it is that we are remarkably good at watching a problem grow right in front of us and doing absolutely nothing about it until it is already standing inside our walls. Whatever the exact cause, one thing is certain. By the start of 1347, Kaffa was dying from the inside. Jani Beg, watching his own forces disappear around him, finally called off the siege. He turned his broken army around and marched away, leaving behind a city that had technically survived, but had already lost something far greater than the battle itself. Because inside those walls, in the crowded houses and narrow streets, the sickness was already spreading. And the Genoese merchants who remained made a decision that must have felt at the time like their only real hope of survival. They gathered whatever they could carry, loaded their ships, and set sail for home. Picture it for a moment. Cramped wooden ships packed full of frightened families sailing away from one nightmare and carrying it with them the entire way. Some of those ships never made it. Old chronicles describe vessels found drifting at sea with every single person on board, already gone, sails still catching the breeze with no living hand left to steer them. Ghost ships essentially moving across open water on nothing but momentum. And this is where our story catches back up to that harbour I mentioned at the very beginning. In October of 1347, a small number of those ships finally reached the port of Messina on the island of Sicily. Word had already reached local officials that something terrible was happening out on the water, so when the ships approached the harbour, masters refused to let them dock. But by then it was already too late. A ship does not actually need to dock for its passengers to come ashore. Ropes get tossed, small boats row back and forth in the dark, and rats slip quietly along mooring lines completely unnoticed, exactly the way they always had. The evening those ships arrived probably looked and sounded almost peaceful. Lanterns swaying gently with the tide, the creak of old rigging, somewhere on shore a dog barking at nothing in particular. Nobody in Messina that night had any reason to believe the quiet was about to end. Local writers from that time described the scene at the docks with a kind of horror that still reads clearly even after nearly 700 years. Sailors too weak to stand at their own posts, men collapsing over their oars before they ever reached the shore. And within days, families throughout Messina, ordinary people who had done nothing wrong except live near a busy harbour, began falling ill in exactly the same way. I think about the ordinary people in that town a lot, honestly. Not the merchants, not the officials, just an average mother somewhere in Messina tucking her children into bed one night, with absolutely no idea that her entire world was about to change within the week. She could not have known. Nobody could have. There was no evening broadcast, no warning system, no way to understand what was quietly drifting toward her on the tide. And maybe that is the part of this story that stays with me the most. Not the horror of what came after, but the innocence right before it. The completely ordinary evening before everything changed forever. From Messina, the sickness did not stay in one place for long. It moved along the coastline to Genoa, to Venice, and outward from there, city by city, port by port, following the exact same trade routes that had made places like Kaffa so prosperous in the first place. Within about 4 years, this single sickness would go on to kill somewhere between 1/3 and 60% of the entire population of Europe, a number so large that most historians still pause for a moment before saying it out loud. To put that in perspective, imagine not losing a few neighbours or even a whole street. Imagine losing something closer to half of every person you have ever known, all within the span of a single ordinary lifetime. But before we go any further down that road, I want you to do something small for me right now. Take a slow breath in and let it back out. Because wherever you're listening to this tonight, you are safe. You are warm. You are hundreds of years and thousands of miles away from that harbour in Sicily. What happened there is history now. It has become memory and story carried forward, mostly so we do not forget how fragile and how remarkably strong human beings can be sometimes within the very same breath. There is one small quiet detail from this exact period of history that I have always loved. On ships crossing the Mediterranean back then, sailors kept a single small oil lamp burning through the night low near the deck, just enough light to find their way without giving away their position to storms or strangers in the dark. A tiny flame inside a very large darkness. I think that is not a bad way to picture the story we're about to spend the next few hours with tonight. Small lights carried by ordinary people through some of the darkest chapters human history has ever written. Because to really understand how a handful of ships turned into a catastrophe that reshaped the entire world, we have to go back even further than that harbour in Sicily. We have to follow this sickness all the way back to where it truly began, deep in the grasslands of Central Asia, riding quietly along one of the busiest trade roads ever built for years, long before a single ship ever raised its sails toward Europe. If you have ever driven through open country late at night, the kind of landscape that just keeps unrolling in every direction with no end in sight, you already have a small feel for the world we're stepping into now. Because roughly 7 centuries ago, somewhere in that same kind of endless country, in the mountain valleys of what is now Kyrgyzstan, this story quietly began long before anyone in Europe had a name for what was coming. And what is strange, and honestly a little beautiful, is that we would not have understood any of it properly until archaeologists digging into frozen ground more than 100 years ago stumbled across a handful of gravestones that nobody at the time thought twice about. Let me back up for a moment, because to really understand how this sickness found its way to a harbour in Sicily, we need to go somewhere far quieter first. Somewhere with no ships, no merchants, no crowded city streets at all. High in the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains in a valley near a lake called Issyk-Kul, small burrowing rodents called marmots have lived for thousands of years in vast underground colonies, entire cities of tunnels dug beneath the grass, largely untouched by the outside world. And living alongside them quietly, patiently for just as long was a bacteria we now call Yersinia pestis. This was not some brand new evil that appeared out of nowhere in the 14th century. It had been there the entire time, cycling calmly between fleas and rodents, in an ecosystem that mostly left human beings alone generation after generation for longer than anyone could possibly measure. Mostly, every so often, for reasons still debated by scientists today, something would shift. A change in rainfall, perhaps, or a disturbance in the rodent population, something that pushed infected fleas out of their usual burrows and into closer contact with the merchants, herders, and travellers moving through that same valley. Some researchers point to a wetter stretch of climate across Central Asia during those years, which likely meant more grass, which meant more marmots, which meant more fleas looking for a new host once their usual one became scarce again. Others suspect it had just as much to do with simple human expansion, more caravans, more trading posts, more people quietly walking straight through territory that had always belonged to the rodents first. Most historians today suspect it was probably a combination of both nature and human activity, nudging against each other at exactly the wrong moment. And when that happened, the bacteria stopped being a quiet resident of the mountains and became something else entirely. For a very long time, historians could only guess when exactly that shift took place. Then in 2022, a team of geneticists and historians published a discovery that finally answered the question, and it came from an unexpected place. Back in the 1880s, a Russian archaeologist working near Lake Issyk-Kul had uncovered two old cemeteries, Kara-Jigash and Brashana, filled with graves from a merchant community that once thrived along the trade routes there. It was the kind of quiet, dusty discovery that rarely makes headlines. Rows of weathered stone markers half sunken into the earth, most of them worn almost smooth by rain, sun, and time. Many of the headstones were carved in an old Christian script used by a community of Church of the East believers who'd settled along that trade corridor, and a handful of them shared one unusual detail. 10 of those stones, dated to the years 1338 and 1339, gave the cause of death as simply pestilence. One of those stones belonged to a man named Sanmak. We know almost nothing else about him. Not his profession, not his family, not even how old he was when he died. Just his name, his faith, and the single word his community chose to carve above him, a word that would sit quietly in the mountain grass for nearly 700 years before anyone understood its full weight. For more than a century, that word sat quietly on a shelf of history, an interesting footnote at best. But modern science can do something remarkable now. Researchers were able to extract fragments of ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from the remains buried at those two cemeteries, and when they compared it against the genetic strain that devastated Europe 8 years later, the match was unmistakable. The bacteria that killed Sanmak and the others, buried near him in 1338 and 1339, was a direct genetic ancestor of the very same plague that would later empty out entire cities from Constantinople to London. In other words, a quiet trading community in the mountains of Central Asia, a place most of us will never visit and had probably never heard of before tonight, is very likely where this entire chapter of human history actually began. I find something oddly moving about that. A man who almost certainly never left his own valley became, without ever knowing it, one small thread at the very start of a catastrophe that would eventually touch nearly every family in Europe. So how does a sickness travel from a handful of quiet graves in the mountains to a harbour on the other side of a continent? The answer has less to do with fate and a lot more to do with roads. By the 1300s, the Mongol Empire controlled the largest connected stretch of land in human history, from the Pacific coast of China all the way to the edges of Eastern Europe. And whatever else can be said about that empire, and there is plenty to say, it built something the ancient world had never quite managed before: a truly unified network of trade routes, relay stations and protected roads stretching across the entire continent. Merchants who once needed armed escorts and small fortunes just to survive a short journey could now travel thousands of miles with a reasonable expectation of arriving safely on the other end. Historians often refer to this period using a rather elegant phrase, the Mongol Peace, because for the first time in recorded memory, an ordinary traveller could realistically walk or ride from the Pacific coast of China almost all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, changing horses and resting at government-run relay stations along the entire route. A famous Venetian merchant named Marco Polo had made almost exactly that journey only a few decades earlier, and his accounts of the wealth and scale of the East fascinated readers back home in Italy for generations. What fascinated them less understandably was the quieter truth sitting underneath that same story. The very same roads that carried silk spices and wondrous tales of distant kingdoms were just as capable of carrying something far less welcome. Goods moved along that network constantly. Silk spices, gemstones, paper ideas, and unfortunately whatever happened to be living in the grain sacks and saddlebags being carried alongside them. A journey that might once have taken a lifetime or simply never happened at all could now be completed in a matter of months, with regular stops for food, fresh horses, and rest along the way. Have you ever noticed how the very things that make our lives more convenient are often the same things that quietly make us more vulnerable? I think about that far more than I probably should. Because what made the Mongol Empire so remarkable, that vast, efficient, astonishingly well-organized network connecting East and West, is the exact same reason a sickness born in a handful of mountain burrows could reach a harbour in Sicily in under a decade. The roads that carried prosperity in one direction were perfectly capable of carrying something else entirely in the other. We tend to think of globalization as a distinctly modern word, something that belongs to airplanes and container ships and overnight delivery. But in a much slower, dustier, horse-drawn way, our ancestors were already living through their own version of it 700 years before any of us were born, and paying for its convenience in exactly the same currency we still pay in today. Now, once this sickness reached human populations, it did not behave in just one way. And this part matters because it changes how quickly and how directly it could move from person to person. Most victims experienced what doctors now call the bubonic form, spread through the bite of an infected flea, causing those painful swollen lumps we talked about earlier, most often near the armpit, the neck, or the groin, wherever the flea happened to bite. That version was serious, often deadly, roughly 6 or 7 out of every 10 cases without treatment, but it generally required a flea to actually pass between hosts, which meant in theory it could be somewhat contained. A smaller number of victims developed something far more dangerous, an infection that spread directly into the bloodstream itself, moving so fast that some people reportedly fell ill and died within hours of their very first symptom, sometimes before a single lump ever had the chance to appear. And then there was a third form, one that did not need fleas or rats or grain sacks at all. When the infection settled into the lungs, it became airborne, spreading directly from one cough to the next, person to person, in crowded rooms aboard cramped ships, inside the sealed wagons of a merchant caravan crossing open country. This pneumonic form was almost always fatal within a day or two, and it explains something that puzzled European chroniclers for centuries afterward: why the sickness sometimes seemed to leap between people who'd never touched a single rat or been anywhere near an open field in their entire lives. For nearly 550 years after all of this, the actual cause of the Black Death remained essentially a mystery. People understood consequences, they understood symptoms, What they did not understand not clearly was what was actually happening inside the human body, and that gap in knowledge would not close until the summer of 1894 in a British colonial hospital on the other side of the world. That year, a fresh outbreak of plague broke out in Hong Kong, killing dozens of people a day within a crowded, densely packed colonial port, and two very different scientists arrived within days of each other to solve the same mystery. The first was a Japanese bacteriologist named Kitasato Shibasaburo, already famous in medical circles for his earlier work on tetanus, backed by his government and accompanied by a full team of assistants. British colonial officials eager to cooperate with a well-credentialed foreign expert gave him immediate access to the hospital, its laboratory equipment and the bodies of plague victims. Within 2 days of arriving, he believed he'd already found the cause, and a telegram announcing his success was already on its way to a major medical journal back in London. 3 days behind him came a quiet, small, French-speaking physician named Alexandre Yersin, who had travelled there almost entirely alone from the coast of Vietnam, carrying nothing more than a portable microscope, a sterilizer, and a handful of glass culture dishes packed carefully in a single travel bag. Because of ongoing colonial tension between France and Britain at the time, and perhaps a touch of simple professional territory, Yersin was denied access to the hospital laboratory and denied access to fresh bodies for study. So he did something almost stubbornly simple. He built himself a small hut out of straw near the hospital grounds and quietly arranged through a bit of persuasion and more than a little bribery aimed at the sailors responsible for burying the dead to get his own samples anyway, working alone late into the night by lamplight, with nobody watching over his shoulder and nobody expecting him to succeed. Working essentially alone in a straw hut using equipment that fit inside a single travel bag, Yersin isolated the bacterium responsible for the plague in less than a week. His notes were precise, his sketches were careful, and his descriptions were accurate in ways that his better-funded rivals rushed out under pressure to be first simply were not. Science, it turns out, is often a little less dramatic than we imagine. Sometimes it is not a gleaming laboratory full of brilliant minds working in perfect harmony. Sometimes it is two exhausted men on opposite sides of a colonial rivalry, both a little annoyed with each other, quietly racing to be the one who finally solves a puzzle that had haunted humanity for over 5 centuries. History eventually credited Yersin as the primary discoverer, and the bacterium was later named in his honour Yersinia pestis, the very same organism whose ancient ancestor we now trace back to a handful of gravestones outside a small mountain lake in Kyrgyzstan. Doesn't it feel a little humbling, honestly, to think that the answer to one of history's greatest mysteries was quite literally written in stone the entire time, waiting patiently for someone to go looking? So now we understand the shape of it. A bacteria that lived quietly in the mountains for thousands of years. A trade network so efficient it could move goods and disease across an entire continent in a matter of months. And 3 different pathways through the human body, each one deadly in its own particular way, one slow enough to almost negotiate with, and one fast enough to outrun any warning at all. All of that had already been set in motion by the time those ships we followed earlier finally reached the harbour at Messina. The sickness was not some sudden isolated accident, a single unlucky twist of fate. It was the almost inevitable result of connection, ecology, and time all quietly converging at once, the way a dozen small unrelated decisions can sometimes add up to something enormous, long before anyone realizes what is happening. What comes next is where this story stops being about mountains and trade routes and microscopes, and becomes something far more personal. Because once this sickness stepped off those ships and into the crowded streets of Europe, it stopped being a matter of biology entirely. It began reshaping the way ordinary people saw their neighbours, their faith in each other in ways that would echo for generations long after the fevers themselves had finally broken. There is a passage written by a young Florentine named Giovanni Boccaccio that historians still return to again and again, not because the writing itself is remarkable, though it often is, but because he was actually there. He watched Florence die around him in 1348, and a few years later, sitting somewhere far quieter, he sat down and wrote about it with a kind of clear, unflinching honesty that most people even now find hard to read in one sitting. He was not writing a history book, not exactly. What he actually produced was a collection of stories framed around 10 young Florentines who flee the dying city for the countryside and pass the time telling each other tales to keep their minds off what they had left behind. But before any of those stories begin, Boccaccio pauses to describe in careful, almost clinical detail exactly what he had witnessed in the city itself, and it is that opening description more than anything else he ever wrote that historians keep coming back to. By the time we're finished with this next stretch of our story, you will understand why some historians consider those 4 years from 1348 to roughly 1351 to be less about a disease itself and more about what a disease does to the people living through it. Boccaccio described something that on the surface sounds almost impossible to believe. Fathers and mothers, he wrote, refused to visit or tend to their own children as though they were no longer their own. Brothers abandoned brothers. Husbands left wives to die alone in empty rooms. This was not because these people had suddenly stopped loving each other. It was because fear, when it grows large enough, can override almost everything else a human being feels. Florence in the year 1348 was one of the largest, wealthier cities in all of Europe, a place of bankers, wool merchants and ambitious families competing constantly for status and influence, the kind of city where fortunes were made and lost within a single generation. Within a matter of months, historians estimate the city lost well over half of its people, a population that had likely stood somewhere around 100,000 before that summer began. Streets that had once been crowded with market stalls, wool carts and church processions fell largely silent, except for the sound of carts collecting bodies each morning, because the ordinary rituals of burial, the prayers, the mourning, the individually dug graves simply could not keep pace with how many people were dying every single day. Priests who once knew every family in their parish by name were burying strangers by the dozen before noon. Have you ever tried to imagine what it would feel like to watch an entire way of life unravel in the space of a single season? Not a war, not a famine spread out over years, but something fast enough that grandparents, parents and children could all be gone within the same short stretch of time. A few days' ride to the south in the rival city of Siena, something happened that I find quietly heartbreaking, and it is still standing today for anyone who wants to see it with their own eyes. In the years just before the plague arrived, Siena had been in the middle of an extraordinary project. The city planned to expand its already beautiful cathedral into something almost unbelievably ambitious, a new nave so enormous it would have made Siena's cathedral one of the largest churches anywhere in the Christian world, larger even than its great rival in Florence. Stonemasons and sculptors had been working on it for nearly a decade. The outer walls were rising, the arches were taking shape. Then, in the summer of 1348, the plague reached Siena, and within months the city lost roughly half of its population, including almost certainly the very sculptor overseeing the project. Construction simply stopped. Not gradually, not as a slow decision made over careful deliberation, but all at once because there were no longer enough workers left alive to lift the stones, and no longer enough survivors left with the resources or the will to keep building something so grand. That unfinished wall is still there. Visitors today can climb it following a narrow staircase built centuries after the fact and stand at the top of a cathedral that Siena never got to finish, looking out over red rooftops and rolling hills, a city that in a very real sense never fully recovered the confidence it carried before that summer. It is called quite simply the Big Facade, and it remains one of the most striking physical scars the Black Death left behind. Anywhere in Europe a monument not to what was built, but to what never got the chance to be. I think there is something almost unbearably honest about a ruin like that. Most monuments celebrate a finished achievement. This one quietly commemorates an interruption, and somehow that makes it more moving, not less. There is a smaller, quieter detail buried in the archives of cities like Florence and Siena that I find almost more affecting than the larger numbers. Historians studying surviving notarial records have found a sudden dramatic spike in wills, written during those exact months, ordinary people rushing to put their affairs in order. The moment they felt the first fever coming on, sometimes finishing the document only hours before they died. You can still read some of them today, brief, hurried, occasionally trailing off mid-sentence small paper monuments to people trying to hold on to some sense of order in the middle of complete chaos. Grief like that does strange things to a community, and in the years that followed we can actually watch two very different responses emerge, almost at the exact same time, sometimes in the very same towns. On one end, groups of penitents known as flagellants began marching from town to town across parts of Germany and Central Europe, dressed in plain white robes marked with a red cross, carrying candles and singing hymns as they moved between villages. Publicly, and often violently, they would whip their own bare backs with knotted cords sometimes, until they bled onto the cobblestones, convinced that visible suffering and open repentance might be the only thing capable of turning aside what many believed was a punishment sent directly from God. Crowds gathered in town squares to watch these processions pass through, some weeping, some joining in on the spot, caught up in the raw emotional intensity of the moment. For a while these groups grew so large and so difficult for local authorities to control that religious leaders eventually stepped in and banned the movement entirely, worried it had stopped being about faith at all and had become something closer to mass hysteria feeding on itself. On the completely opposite end of that same spectrum, Boccaccio describes another response entirely. If death was coming regardless of how carefully or virtuously anyone lived, some people reasoned, then perhaps the only sensible choice left was to abandon restraint altogether. He writes of neighbours who spent their final weeks in constant drinking and celebration, moving from house to house, drifting between whichever homes still had food or wine left in them, treating pleasure as the last rational response to a world that no longer seemed to follow any rules at all. Locked doors meant nothing anymore. Neither did reputation or manners, or the careful social order that had structured Florentine life for generations. When the ordinary consequences of behaviour seemed to disappear overnight, Boccaccio suggests some people discover a version of themselves they might never have met otherwise. Self-punishment on one side, total abandon on the other. And somewhere in between, most ordinary people simply trying to survive one more day doing whatever quietly made sense to them in a moment when nothing made sense at all. There is a darker part of this story too, and I do not think it is honest or useful to skip past it quietly. As fear spread faster than any real understanding of the disease itself, communities across parts of France, Spain and especially Germany began searching for someone to blame, and tragically, Jewish communities became the target of horrifying accusations, most commonly that they had deliberately poisoned local wells. In city after city, this baseless rumour led to violent massacres, and historians estimate that several hundred Jewish communities across Europe were destroyed, expelled, or permanently scattered during this brief, terrible stretch of years. In February of 1349, in the city of Strasbourg, thousands of Jewish residents were killed in a single coordinated act of mob violence. What makes this particular tragedy even harder to process is a detail many people are never taught. At the time of that massacre, the plague had not yet actually reached Strasbourg. The violence happened out of pure anticipatory fear, not even in response to local deaths that had already occurred. Remarkably, even by the standards of the 14th century, the highest religious authority in Europe spoke out clearly against this. Pope Clement VI issued a formal declaration insisting that Jewish communities could not possibly be responsible, pointing out with fairly obvious logic that Jewish people were dying of the same plague in the same numbers in regions all across the world, including places where no Jewish community had ever even lived. He described those spreading the accusations as having been, in his own words, seduced by that liar the devil. It is one of the more remarkable moral stances of the medieval church, and tragically, in most of the towns where it mattered most, almost nobody listened. I think that detail says something uncomfortable but important about how fear actually works. It does not always wait for evidence, and it rarely waits for calm reflection. Sometimes it moves faster than the truth ever could, spreading through a frightened crowd, the same way the sickness itself spread through a crowded street. And by the time reason finally catches up, the damage is already permanent and impossible to undo with an apology or a papal letter written months too late. But I do not want to leave you with only that image, because it is not the whole truth of this period either, and I think that matters. In cities across Italy, groups of lay people, often organised through religious confraternities, made the opposite choice entirely. Volunteers, many of them ordinary tradespeople rather than clergy, bakers, cloth merchants, stonemasons, took on the almost unthinkable task of carrying the sick to shelter washing bodies for proper burial and comforting dying strangers who had been abandoned by their own frightened families. They wore simple hooded robes to hide their identity, partly out of humility, and partly, historians suspect, because even the people brave enough to help were sometimes ashamed of how frightened they still felt underneath it all. They did this fully aware of the risk to themselves, without any modern understanding of contagion, guided by little more than a stubborn, unglamorous belief that somebody needed to. Some of those same charitable organizations, quietly founded or strengthened during those exact years, are still operating in parts of Italy today, nearly 7 centuries later, still wearing similar robes, still answering emergency calls, a thread of ordinary compassion that somehow survived everything else that fell apart around it. And here is something else worth sitting with for a moment, an angle that rarely makes it into the more dramatic retellings of this story. Once the worst of the dying finally slowed, the economic ground beneath medieval Europe had shifted in a way nobody had intended or planned for. With so many labourers gone, the ones who survived suddenly found their work worth far more than it had been before. A farmhand who once had to compete for scraps of work could now walk away from an unfair employer and reasonably expect to find better terms just down the road. Wages rose sharply, simply because there were not enough hands left to bring in harvests, tend livestock, or work the land. In England, landowners grew alarmed enough by this shift that Parliament passed something called the Statute of Labourers in 1351, an attempt to legally freeze wages back down to their old cheaper levels, essentially trying to legislate the old social order back into existence by force. It mostly failed. Peasants who had buried half their village had also, without ever intending to, discovered a kind of leverage their grandparents never had, and the quiet resentment that law created would go on shaping English society for decades afterward, eventually feeding into unrest that would boil over a full generation later. So when I look back at these 4 years, I do not see a single simple story of horror, even though the horror was real and enormous and deserves to be remembered honestly rather than softened for comfort. I see something messier than that, and honestly something more human. A society that produced both mob violence and quiet heroism within the very same seasons, sometimes on the very same street, sometimes within the very same family. People capable of abandoning their own children out of fear, and people capable of carrying a dying stranger to shelter out of nothing more than conscience, often within walking distance of each other. Maybe that tension is not unique to the 14th century at all. Maybe it is simply what happens to any of us in any era when the ground beneath ordinary life suddenly disappears, and there is no way of knowing until it actually happens to us which version of ourselves would step forward first. This was not, however, the first time something like this had happened to a great civilization, and I think that is worth remembering too, especially on a night like this. Long before Boccaccio ever picked up a pen, and centuries before a single stone was laid for that unfinished cathedral in Siena, another empire older and in many ways grander than 14th century Florence had already lived through its own version of exactly this kind of collapse, in a city that once considered itself the very centre of the civilized world. Picture for a moment a single building, a massive dome of stone and gold-flecked glass rising higher than anything else in the known world at the time, built in under 6 years by an emperor who wanted quite openly to outdo every temple and palace that had ever come before it. Workers hauled marble from quarries scattered across the empire, purple stone from Egypt, green stone from Greece, polishing columns that had in some cases already stood in older temples for centuries before being carried to this new site and given a second life. When it was finished in the year 537, that emperor reportedly walked inside, looked up into the vast golden ceiling far above him, and declared that he had finally surpassed the great King Solomon himself. His name was Justinian, and for a few short years it must have felt like he was right. Now hold on to that image for a moment, because I want you to sit with the sheer confidence of it. The golden light, the soaring stone, the feeling of a man standing at the absolute peak of human ambition. I want you to remember it clearly, because within 4 years of that ceiling being finished, the very same emperor would be watching bodies pile up faster than his officials could count them, in a city that believed right up until that point it was untouchable. Constantinople in the 6th century considered itself the centre of civilization itself, a sprawling wealthy capital of perhaps 500,000 people, crowded with merchants, chariot-racing fans, theologians and foreign diplomats from as far away as Persia and the edges of the known world. It was the capital of what we now call the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of what had once been the Roman Empire, and under Justinian it was in the middle of an extraordinary revival. His armies, led by a brilliant general named Belisarius, were busy retaking territory. The Western Roman Empire had lost generations earlier, North Africa first, then Italy itself, city by city. His legal scholars had just finished compiling a vast organized code of Roman law, so thorough and so well structured that portions of it still quietly influence legal systems around the world, today nearly 1,500 years later. For a brief shining window, it looked as though the old empire might actually rise again, fully intact, gathered back under a single ambitious ruler. And then in the year 541 a ship, or more likely several ships, sailed into the harbour at Pelusium, a small Egyptian port near the mouth of the Nile, carrying grain, and carrying something else, entirely, something we now understand to have been the very same bacteria that would return to devastate Europe 8 centuries later. This was its first great performance on the world stage, centuries before anyone called it the Black Death. We actually have an eyewitness account of what happened next, which is rare enough for this period of history to be remarkable all on its own. His name was Procopius, and his story is almost as strange as the plague itself. Procopius was Justinian's own court historian, a trusted insider who travelled with Belisarius on campaign, and wrote official, carefully worded accounts praising the emperor's wars and victories for the public record. But quietly in secret, working perhaps late at night in whatever spare room he could find for it, Procopius was also writing something else entirely, a second manuscript he apparently never intended to publish. While he was alive, a scathing, almost gossipy takedown of Justinian and his wife, the Empress Theodora, accusing them of cruelty, corruption, and outright incompetence behind closed doors. It reads at points less like formal history and more like the diary of someone who has finally stopped holding his tongue. Historians only discovered the second book centuries later, buried deep in the Vatican Library, and they gave it a fitting name, The Secret History. So when Procopius describes the plague, we're hearing from a man who clearly did not love the emperor he was writing about, which makes his account fascinating, but also, and I think this matters quite a bit, not entirely neutral. According to Procopius, the plague struck Constantinople with a speed and scale that felt almost supernatural. At its worst, he claimed the city was losing 10,000 people a day. Modern historians generally treat that specific number with real caution. Ancient writers were not counting corpses with any kind of careful method, and numbers like that tended to grow larger every time a story got repeated around a dinner table. But even if we cut that figure down considerably, and most scholars believe we should, the scale of death was still staggering enough to break the ordinary machinery of a functioning city completely. Have you ever wondered what a city actually does, practically speaking, when its entire system for honouring the dead simply stops working? In Constantinople, the answer was as grim as you would expect. Burial pits were dug across the water at a district called Psyche deep enough, according to Procopius, to hold tens of thousands of bodies at once, and when those filled completely, officials began stacking bodies inside the roofless towers built into the city's own defensive walls, sealing them shut once they were full, turning the very structures meant to protect the living into makeshift tombs instead. Other bodies were loaded onto barges rowed out into open water, and simply released only for some of them to wash back onto the shoreline, days later drifting past fishing boats and cargo ships still trying to carry on with ordinary business. One of Justinian's own officials, a man named Theodore, was placed in charge of managing this entire grim logistical nightmare, essentially becoming the empire's first minister of mass mortality, a job title that almost certainly did not exist the year before, and one I imagine he never wanted. And within that horror, Procopius records something quietly haunting about how ordinary people responded something a little different from panic itself. Many residents, he wrote, began seeing visions in the hours before. They fell ill, ghostly figures appearing at their bedside or in doorways just before the first symptoms arrived, and some truly believed these apparitions were a kind of warning, a demon selecting its next victim before the fever ever set in. Out of that fear, families started locking their doors, completely refusing entry, even to relatives and old friends convinced that whatever force was choosing its next target might slip inside along with a visitor carrying nothing more dangerous, they believed, than bad luck. Priests reported congregations shrinking overnight, not because faith had weakened, but because people were suddenly too afraid to gather in one room together, an instinct that in hindsight was probably one of the more medically sound decisions anyone made during the entire crisis, even without understanding why. Some accounts from the period even describe people beginning to wear small tags bearing their own names tucked into the folds of their clothing, so that if they collapsed alone in the street, whoever eventually found them would at least know who they had been rather than adding one more nameless body to a pit that already held thousands. I find that detail honestly harder to sit with than almost anything else in this story. Not the death toll, not the overflowing towers, but the quiet, practical fear of dying as a stranger and wanting more than anything else simply to be remembered by name. Justinian himself caught the disease. This is one of the few details Procopius records that historians take fairly seriously, since it appears in more than one independent account from the period. The emperor of the entire Eastern Roman world, the man who had just declared himself greater than Solomon, spent weeks fighting for his own life in a palace surrounded by a city that was actively burying itself. He survived, though, barely, and for a tense stretch of time with no clear heir named, and his wife Theodora reportedly refusing to even discuss the topic of succession. While he lay ill, several of his own generals and advisors apparently began quietly, cautiously wondering aloud what might happen to the empire and to their own careers if the emperor simply did not wake up. The empire came within a fever's breath of a full leadership crisis, layered directly on top of a public health catastrophe it was already failing to manage. He recovered. The empire did not fully and not in the way he had planned. It is worth remembering, too, that this sickness never respected the borders drawn on any map. It spread west into Italy and Gaul, along the very same shipping lanes that carried Justinian's soldiers and supplies, and it spread east as well, deep into the territory of the Sasanian Persian Empire, the Byzantines' oldest and most persistent rival. In a strange way, the plague became one of the only forces in that entire era capable of striking both warring empires with equal indifferent cruelty, weakening Constantinople and its greatest enemy, at almost exactly the same time as though the disease itself had no interest whatsoever in who eventually won their long, exhausting rivalry. Here is where this story becomes remarkably interesting to me beyond the raw horror of it, because historians today are locked in an active ongoing argument about exactly how much damage this plague actually did, and it is one of those rare academic disputes where reasonable, careful scholars land in completely different places using the very same evidence. For a long time, the standard version of this story matched the dramatic tone of Procopius, almost exactly a catastrophe so severe it permanently crippled the Byzantine economy, decimated its population by as much as half, and effectively ended the ancient world in one violent stroke, ushering in what people used to casually call the Dark Ages. Then, starting around 2019, a group of researchers began quietly poking holes in that narrative, and I have to say, their methods are almost as interesting as their conclusion. They studied surviving papyri covered in tax records, coin production numbers pulled from mints across the empire, and even pollen samples pulled from ancient soil layers, looking for the kind of clear economic collapse or abandoned farmland you would expect after losing a third or more of the population in a single generation. What they found in several regions was surprisingly little disruption. Coins kept being minted at roughly the same rate, fields kept being farmed, land sale records continued much as they had before. Some historians began arguing the entire crisis has been dramatically overstated, an ancient best-selling horror story, more than an accurate demographic record kept alive, mostly because it made for such a compelling narrative. Other historians pushed back hard, and this argument is still going on right now, essentially unresolved in academic journals published within the last few years. They argue the revisionists were reading incomplete evidence too literally, that regional variation does not disprove enormous suffering in the hardest hit cities, and that dismissing Procopius entirely just because he exaggerated some numbers throws away a rare and valuable witness along with his flawed arithmetic. I have to admit there is something I quite enjoy about that kind of unresolved argument. We like to imagine history as a settled collection of facts, dates memorized once and never revisited. But the truth is messier and more alive than that. Real historians are still this very year arguing about exactly how much a 6th century plague actually mattered, using evidence buried in dirt and preserved on scraps of ancient paper. That is not a flaw in how history works. I think that is actually the most honest thing about it. What we can say with real confidence is this. Whatever the precise numbers were, the plague arrived at the worst possible moment for Justinian's grand ambition of reuniting the old Roman world. Belisarius's campaign in Italy, which had seemed close to a decisive victory just before the outbreak, with the Ostrogothic capital already surrounded and negotiations for surrender apparently underway, dragged on instead for nearly 2 more decades, devastating the Italian countryside through prolonged warfare that a healthier, more populated empire might have ended far more quickly and far more decisively. Farms that fed soldiers went untended. Tax revenue that paid soldiers dried up in exactly the regions hit hardest. Some historians argue that this delay made worse by a plague thinning both soldiers and taxpayers at exactly the same time quietly doomed any lasting Byzantine hold over Italy, leaving the peninsula fractured, exhausted, and vulnerable to a new wave of invasion by a Germanic people called the Lombards, within a single generation undoing much of what Belisarius had originally fought so hard to reclaim. So maybe that is the real quieter tragedy hiding underneath Procopius's dramatic body counts. Not simply the deaths themselves, staggering as they clearly were, but the way a single poorly timed catastrophe can gently redirect the entire future of a civilization, closing a door that had only just barely creaked open decades or even centuries before anyone alive at the time could possibly have understood what had been lost. Which version do you find more convincing, honestly, the dramatic collapse Procopius wanted us to believe, or the quieter, messier picture the coins and pollen samples seem to suggest? I go back and forth myself, depending on the week. There is something almost uncomfortably familiar about a golden dome finished 4 years before disaster isn't there, a moment of pure confidence right before the ground quietly shifts underneath it, without any warning bell, without any sense that history was about to turn a corner. I do not think that pattern belongs only to the 6th century, and if I am honest, I do not think it ever really goes out of fashion. And here is what I keep coming back to as we close out this particular chapter of the story. Constantinople was not the first great city to believe, right up until the moment it stopped being true, that it stood permanently above this kind of catastrophe. Centuries before Justinian ever laid eyes on his golden dome, another civilization, one that still shapes how we think about democracy, philosophy and public life today, had already lived through its own devastating brush with an unseen killer in the middle of a war it was already struggling to win. There is a moment near the end of a great man's life that I keep returning to whenever I think about how easily we misjudge what actually matters. He was lying in bed, dying, the room dim and quiet, surrounded by friends who assumed he was too weak to hear them anymore. So they began speaking about him, as though he were already gone, listing his finest achievements out loud in low, respectful voices, his military victories, the buildings he'd commissioned, the empire he'd helped build. And then quietly from somewhere inside that stillness he stopped them. He told them they had missed his greatest accomplishment entirely. Not the battles won, not the marble monuments still rising across the city outside his window. His proudest achievement, he said, was this: no living citizen of Athens had ever been forced into mourning because of something he had done. It is a remarkably striking thing to say, and it becomes almost unbearably ironic once you know that by the time he said it, this man had already buried his own sister and both of his sons within the space of a single terrible year. His name was Pericles, and to understand how Athens, the birthplace of democracy, theatre and philosophy, as we still practice them today, ended up in that room with him, We need to rewind almost 2,500 years back to a war built on a plan that must have sounded brilliant on paper. In the year 431, Athens went to war with its great rival Sparta. Pericles, the city's leading statesman, understood something important about that conflict from the very beginning. Athens could never beat Sparta's legendary army in an open land battle. What Athens had instead was its navy, the finest in the ancient world, and a set of long, fortified walls connecting the city itself down to its port at Piraeus. So Pericles made a calculated gamble. Rather than defend the surrounding countryside of Attica, he ordered the rural population to abandon their farms entirely and crowd inside those walls, trusting that Athens could simply outlast Sparta by sea, while its enemies wasted themselves marching uselessly through empty fields. It was strategically a remarkably clever plan, the kind of calculated risk that historians still study in military academies today. It was also, though nobody could have known it at the time, an almost perfect recipe for catastrophe, the sort of blind spot that only becomes visible centuries later, once we already know how the story ends. By the summer of the year, 430 refugees from the countryside were packed into every available space inside those walls, sleeping in temples in makeshift shelters, wedged between buildings in any patch of open ground they could claim for themselves. Farmers who had spent their whole lives under open sky now found themselves crowded into tents and lean-tos in the shadow of the Acropolis, sharing wells, sharing air, sharing whatever scraps of privacy the city could still offer. And into that crowded, sweltering city, according to our best historical source, a sickness arrived, most likely carried in through the busy harbour at Piraeus, and it began spreading through the packed population with terrifying speed. Thucydides himself believed the sickness had travelled a long distance to reach them, originating somewhere south of Egypt, in the region the Greeks called Ethiopia, before moving north through Egypt and the wider Mediterranean world and finally arriving at his own city's front door. Whether that particular detail is accurate or not, it tells us something interesting on its own, that even in the 5th century an Athenian historian instinctively understood sickness as something that travelled along the same trade and shipping routes that carried grain pottery and soldiers arriving from far away, rather than simply appearing out of nowhere. Our best historical source for what happened next is a man named Thucydides, and I want to spend a moment on him specifically, because the way he chose to write about this moment still shapes how historians study epidemics today. Thucydides was an Athenian general, and he caught the sickness himself and survived it. Unlike a certain court historian we met earlier in this story quietly settling old scores, from inside a palace he was paid to praise, Thucydides had no personal grudge to nurse, and no emperor to secretly resent. He stated his purpose plainly, almost bluntly for a writer of his era. He wanted to describe the symptoms with enough precision that future generations faced with the same sickness would be able to recognize it immediately, whether that happened in 10 years or in 10 centuries. That is a remarkably modern instinct for someone writing roughly 2,400 years before modern medicine even existed, closer in spirit to a careful field researcher than to a court chronicler settling scores, and his description is difficult to read even now in ways that go well beyond ordinary discomfort. He describes sudden, intense heat inside the head, inflamed and reddened eyes, throats and tongues that filled with blood breath that turned foul and unnatural, violent coughing and retching that produced nothing at all. Patients broke out in pustules and ulcers across their skin, and some experienced a burning sensation so severe that they could not bear even the lightest bedsheet against their body. Many were consumed by a thirst so unbearable that some threw themselves into wells and cisterns, desperate for any relief, even though the water itself brought them no comfort. Sleep became impossible, no matter how exhausted the body became. Those who survived the first agonizing week were often struck next by uncontrollable diarrhea, which finished off many of the very people who thought they had already endured the worst of it, and those who lived past even that sometimes lost fingers, toes, or their eyesight entirely, carrying the sickness with them quite literally for the rest of their lives. Have you ever wondered what it does to a community when the disease itself seems to specifically punish hope, striking hardest at exactly the moment someone believes they might be recovering? There is one detail in Thucydides that I find almost harder to sit with than any of the physical suffering he describes. Some survivors, he wrote, emerged from the sickness having lost their memory completely. Not confused for a few days, but truly unable to recognize their own families, their closest friends, even themselves, as though the disease had reached in and quietly erased who they had been before it arrived. And yet buried within all of that horror, Thucydides also noticed something that would not be properly understood scientifically speaking for well over 2,000 years afterward. He observed that people who survived the sickness almost never caught it again, even when they deliberately exposed themselves while caring for the dying, walking straight into rooms other Athenians refused to enter. Historians now consider this one of the earliest written observations of acquired immunity anywhere in human history, a Greek general, noticing purely through careful watching, and no formal medical training at all. Something we would not properly explain until the modern study of the immune system many centuries later. Survivors like Thucydides himself became the city's most trusted caretakers during the outbreak's later waves, precisely because everyone had quietly figured out they could not get sick a second time, even if nobody could have told you why. Rumours inevitably went looking for someone to blame. Some Athenians whispered that Spartan agents had deliberately poisoned the wells feeding the city, a suspicion that must have felt entirely reasonable in the moment, considering how conveniently the Spartan countryside itself seemed almost completely untouched by the same sickness. Thucydides, to his enormous credit, investigated that rumour directly in his own writing and dismissed it outright. He understood correctly that Sparta's army simply avoided marching directly into an infected city, which was ordinary battlefield caution rather than any kind of hidden sabotage. It is a small moment easy to skip past in a longer history, but I think it matters quite a bit. In a city gripped by fear and grief, here was one man choosing evidence over suspicion, and writing that choice down carefully for anyone in the future willing to read it. The disease did not spare social status. It reached into the household of Pericles himself, taking his sister, and then within months both of his legitimate sons Xanthippus and Paralus, one after the other, in a span of time far too short for any family to properly grieve one loss before the next arrived. Thucydides tells us that Pericles bore the earlier losses with a kind of practiced composure, the discipline of a man who had spent his entire life in public view, unwilling to let his private grief become a spectacle for the city he governed. But when his last surviving legitimate son died, something in him finally broke. He's said to have collapsed into open, uncontrollable weeping at the funeral, placing the traditional garland on his son's head, with hands that would not stop shaking in front of the entire city he had spent decades governing with careful, almost rehearsed restraint. Pericles himself died not long afterward, in the autumn of the year 429, weakened by the same sickness that had already taken almost everyone close to him. Thucydides considered his death an outright disaster for Athens, arguing that the leaders who followed lacked his patience and long-term vision, chasing short-term glory instead of the slow, careful strategy that might have actually won the war. I think there is something worth sitting with in that particular tragedy. Sparta's army, for all its legendary discipline, never once managed to breach those walls Pericles had built his entire strategy around. It took an enemy nobody could see, arriving quietly through a crowded harbour to accomplish what an entire hostile army could not, removing the one leader steady enough to guide Athens safely through a war he himself had helped begin. Beyond politics, this sickness also quietly unravelled something the Greeks considered almost sacred proper burial for the dead. In a culture where funeral rites carried enormous religious weight, where an improperly buried soul was believed to wander restlessly, unable to find peace in the afterlife, Thucydides describes families abandoning even that most basic obligation. Overwhelmed mourners would find a stranger's funeral pyre already burning, add their own dead to it without ceremony or prayer, and simply walk away into the smoke too exhausted or too frightened to wait for a proper rite of their own. Some even resorted to stealing wood meant for someone else's pyre just to finish burning their own family's dead before dawn. It was in a very particular Athenian sense not just a public health disaster, but a spiritual one, an entire society losing its grip on rituals that had structured Greek life and Greek belief about death itself for centuries before that summer. So what actually caused all of this here is where the story becomes even today a wide-open scientific mystery. Modern researchers have proposed typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox and measles among other possibilities, largely because Thucydides never once mentions the swollen lumps called buboes that define true bubonic plague, the very disease we've already spent considerable time with earlier in this story. In the 1990s, construction workers preparing a new subway station near an ancient cemetery called the Keramikos accidentally uncovered a mass grave dating almost exactly to this period, bodies hastily thrown into pits rather than properly buried, matching Thucydides' account with unsettling precision. Just this year, researchers analysing preserved dental material recovered from that very grave proposed yet another candidate, entirely a severe bacterial infection related to modern salmonella, spread through contaminated food and water in exactly the kind of overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that packed refugee camp of a city had quietly become. Other specialists remain unconvinced, pointing out that ancient dental material is notoriously difficult to work with, and that a single grave cannot settle a question this large on its own. The debate continues actively in scientific journals being published as recently as this year over a sickness that struck 24 centuries ago in a city most of those researchers have probably walked through themselves on the way to a conference. I find something quietly beautiful in that, honestly. That a mystery this old can still pull in serious researchers today, still matter enough to argue about using tools Thucydides could never have imagined in service of a promise he made to us across nearly 2,500 years that we would eventually be able to recognize it. Athens technically survived this war, though barely, and Sparta would not claim final victory for another 25 years. But many historians argue the city never fully recovered the confidence the population or the steady leadership it lost during those brief, brutal seasons of sickness. The golden age of Pericles, the age that gave the world the Parthenon, the philosophy of Socrates and the very idea of democratic government, didn't end with the decisive battlefield defeat at all. It slipped away quietly inside crowded, feverish streets, undone by something no soldier on either side ever managed to see coming. Sometimes I wonder how differently that entire war, and perhaps the following few centuries of Greek history, might have unfolded if Pericles had simply lived another 10 or 15 years. We will never know, of course. History rarely allows us that particular comfort. For thousands of years after Athens, after Constantinople, and after every plague we have walked through together tonight, humanity kept meeting sickness the exact same way, helplessly reactively always, one step behind, burying the dead and waiting for the fever to simply run its course on its own terms. Nobody had yet figured out how to see a disease coming early enough to actually get ahead of it, to stop it before it ever crossed a threshold. That would not happen for almost 2,000 more years, and when someone finally did figure it out, it did not happen in a grand capital city at all. It happened in a small, stubborn port town that decided quite simply it was tired of waiting to find out who was sick, only after it was already too late. Here is a strange little detail I want to start with because I think it explains almost everything else in this next part of the story before we even get to the plague itself. In one small, wealthy trading city on the Adriatic coast, the person in charge of the entire government was only allowed to hold power for a single month at a time, not a year, not a term of several years the way we might expect from a president or a prime minister today. 1 month, and then he had to hand the keys over to somebody else, entirely move out of the official residence, and wait roughly 2 more years before he was even allowed to run again. Picture trying to run a whole city that way. You would barely learn where the good bakery was before your time in office ended, let alone have enough time to quietly enrich yourself or your family at the public's expense. It sounds almost comically inefficient. And yet I would argue that this one strange little rule is a big part of why this particular city, more than almost any other place in Europe, actually managed to outthink the plague decades before anyone understood what plague even was. That city was Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik, sitting on a narrow strip of coastline in what is now Croatia, wedged between the much larger powers of Venice and the growing Ottoman Empire, 2 neighbours that could have swallowed it whole many times over if they had ever seriously tried. It survived and even thrived for centuries, mostly through careful diplomacy, rather than military strength. A small republic that stayed independent by being smarter, quicker, and more agile than its enormous neighbours, paying tribute when it needed to, negotiating when it could, and quietly building one of the most respected merchant fleets in the entire Mediterranean. And because power inside the city rotated so quickly, no single wealthy family could ever fully seize control of it, the way powerful dynasties did in so many other Italian and Adriatic cities. Decisions tended to get made by committee carefully, cautiously, and with an unusual amount of attention paid to actual evidence rather than personal ambition or family pride. By the final decades of the 1300s, Ragusa had already lived through wave after wave of the same sickness we followed into that harbour in Sicily at the very beginning of tonight's story. The plague had struck the city in 1348, then returned again in 1358, 1361, 1363 and 1371, each outbreak arriving the exact same way, carried in by the very trade ships that kept the city wealthy in the first place. A grim, exhausting rhythm repeating roughly once every decade like clockwork. By this point, the Ragusans were not confused about what was happening anymore, in the way earlier societies we have talked about tonight had been. They understood, at least loosely, that sickness seemed to travel with ships and travellers, coming from certain places, arriving with predictable regularity whenever trade with infected regions resumed. What they still lacked was any real understanding of why, since the science of bacteria and contagion was still 5 centuries away from being discovered, so they did something remarkably practical instead. If they could not understand the mechanism, they decided they would simply act on the pattern they'd already observed. Even before any formal law existed, a physician working in the city, a Jewish doctor named Jacob of Padua, had already begun quietly isolating suspected plague carriers in shelters built outside the city walls, keeping them separate from the healthy population, while doctors watched carefully to see who developed symptoms and who did not, adjusting his methods slightly with each new outbreak he witnessed. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. In other parts of Europe during this exact same era, we have already talked about Jewish communities being blamed, persecuted and murdered simply for existing near an outbreak, accused of crimes they had nothing to do with. Here in Ragusa, a Jewish physician was instead trusted with one of the most important medical decisions the city would ever make, and became one of the key minds behind a policy that would eventually help save it again and again for centuries afterward. Then, on the 27th day of July in the year 1377, Ragusa's Great Council made that informal practice official, turning Jacob of Padua's quiet, improvised habit into permanent law. The surviving document still kept today in the city's archives, bound carefully into a law book. The Ragusans called the Green Book, states plainly that visitors from plague-affected areas would not be admitted into the city or its surrounding territory until they had spent a full month in isolation on a nearby island undergoing what the law simply called cleansing. No exceptions were carved out for wealth or status. A prince and a dockhand waited the exact same 30 days on the exact same rocky patch of coastline, which tells you something about how seriously the council intended this to be enforced. Try picturing that for a moment from the deck of an incoming ship. Picture a merchant vessel weeks out from port low on fresh water, its crew exhausted, sunburned and homesick, finally spotting the familiar limestone walls of Ragusa, rising on the horizon after a long uncertain voyage. And instead of sailing gratefully into harbour to unload their cargo and sleep in an actual bed for the first time in months, that ship was redirected toward a small, mostly barren island called Mercan, or sometimes toward the town of Kavtat further down the coast, where the crew would then wait, watching their destination sit tantalizingly close in the distance for 30 entire days, with absolutely no guarantee anyone on board was actually sick at all. No entertainment, no fresh supplies beyond the basics they had brought or could be rowed out to them. Just time distance and uncertainty, while the city they could practically see chose caution over hospitality day after day after day. What do you think that kind of waiting does to a person watching home sit just out of reach, unable to prove your own good health to anyone? I imagine that must have felt almost cruel in the moment, honestly, especially if you were perfectly healthy and simply unlucky enough to be sailing in from the wrong port at the wrong time. But it worked often enough that the practice quickly proved its worth, and Ragusa kept using it, refining it, expanding it decade after decade, gradually adding more islands to the rotation as trade increased and more ships needed somewhere to wait. That original waiting period lasted 30 days, and the Ragusans had a specific word for it, borrowed from the Italian word for 30 Trentino. Within a matter of decades, the isolation period for travellers arriving by land was extended even further to 40 days, and it is that particular number 40 in Italian that eventually gave us the English word we still use today, quarantine. Why 40 specifically rather than some other round number? Historians studying the surviving record suggest it was probably not one single reason, but several ideas quietly reinforcing each other at once. 40 carried enormous symbolic weight for medieval Christians, the number of days it rained during the Great Flood in the Book of Genesis, the number of days Jesus reportedly spent fasting in the wilderness. At the same time, physicians trained in the older Greek medical tradition of Hippocrates believed that serious illnesses generally revealed themselves one way or another within roughly 40 days of exposure. Somewhere between ancient medical theory, deep religious symbolism and plain observed experience, the number 40 simply began to feel right, and once it worked reliably enough, nobody saw much reason to argue with it. By 1390, Ragusa had established what historians consider one of the very first permanent public health offices anywhere in the world, and by 1397 that office had become a fully elected, ongoing branch of government. This is worth sitting with for a moment because Venice, a city many times larger and wealthier than Ragusa, did not create a comparable health office until 1486. Florence waited until 1527, A small republic on a narrow strip of Adriatic coastline had quietly outpaced almost every larger power in Europe by nearly a century and a half. By 1426, the Great Council had gone even further, appointing officials known rather bluntly as kakamorti, a title borrowed from words meaning roughly to hunt down death itself. These officials carried real serious authority during outbreaks, answerable directly to the council, rather than to any single noble family. They tracked every single case of illness reported inside the city, recording the name of the sick person, the exact address of their household, and the names of every relative who might have been exposed, all written carefully into dedicated record books that were updated as the situation changed. By the middle of the 1400s, officials were even using these accumulated records to track how a disease moved from one household to the next, across the city, essentially mapping the outbreak by hand decades before anyone had the mathematical tools we now take for granted for that kind of work. If that sounds strangely familiar, something close to modern contact tracing, that is because it essentially was roughly 400 years before anyone used that particular phrase. I have to admit there is something I find quietly moving about that level of bureaucratic care applied consistently patiently, generation after generation, by people who still had absolutely no idea what a bacterium even was, or how contagion technically worked at the cellular level. They were not chasing a scientific theory they could prove in a laboratory. They were simply following a pattern that kept working, refining it slightly with each new outbreak, trusting careful observation over any grand satisfying explanation. It would be a little too generous, though, to paint Ragusa's leaders as purely selfless heroes acting only out of concern for public health, and I do not think we should let them off that easily, just because the story is more inspiring that way. Historians who have studied the surviving records closely point out that economics played just as large a role in these decisions as compassion did arguably a larger one. Ragusa's entire existence depended on trade on trustworthy ships, arriving safely on merchants across the Mediterranean, believing that goods coming from Ragusa were clean, reliable, and worth paying a premium for. Protecting the city from repeated plague outbreaks was not only about saving lives, though it certainly did that again and again. It was also quite plainly about protecting the city's reputation, its trade relationships, and therefore its income. I think that is actually a more interesting story than a simple tale of pure altruism, and a bit more useful too. Good policy does not always require pure motives. Sometimes self-interest and genuine public good happen to point in exactly the same direction, and honestly the outcome ends up mattering far more than the reasoning that got everyone there. By 1590 the system had grown sophisticated enough that Ragusa built a large permanent quarantine complex right beside the city walls, near the eastern gate close to the harbour, with separate courtyards, guarded entrances and strict rules, preventing any contact between residents and whoever was waiting inside. Merchants arriving by land stayed in the complex itself, while sailors were quarantined aboard their own ships, anchored just offshore, where guards could watch them without ever needing to make contact. Even then, some Ragusans reportedly resisted having the facility built so close to their homes, delaying construction for decades out of simple discomfort at living near it, which tells you something rather human and familiar about how people react to public health measures, even ones that had already been proven repeatedly across more than 2 centuries to work. What strikes me most looking back at all of this from where we're sitting tonight is how differently Ragusa approached the exact same enemy that had already devastated Constantinople and Florence and ancient Athens, all the places we have already walked through together this evening. Those earlier societies mostly reacted to the plague after it had already arrived, treating each outbreak as a fresh, unexplainable tragedy, something to be endured rather than prevented. Ragusa quietly and without any dramatic turning point or single heroic figure to credit, decided instead to meet the danger before it ever reached the front gate. No prayers alone to appease an angry god, though those continued too quietly alongside everything else. No search for someone to blame, just patient repeated observation translated carefully into policy and adjusted slightly every time new evidence came in year after year, council after council. This idea did not stay confined to one small stretch of Adriatic coastline for very long. Word of Ragusa's success travelled along the exact same trade routes that had once carried the plague itself, and within a few generations similar quarantine systems began appearing in Venice, then Genoa, then port cities scattered across the entire Mediterranean, each one adapting the same basic idea to its own harbour and its own politics. It would take centuries more for the practice to spread fully across northern Europe, moving slowly, unevenly, often only adopted after a city had already suffered through one catastrophe too many. And as we're about to see, even after everyone technically understood that isolation worked, even after the evidence had been sitting in plain sight for nearly 300 years, some of the largest, proudest cities in the world would still manage to get the response almost catastrophically wrong when their own moment of crisis finally arrived at their gates. Drury Lane, London, on the 7th day of June in the year 1665. A young civil servant named Samuel Pepys was walking home on what he later called the hottest day he had ever felt in his life, when something stopped him cold in the street. 2 or 3 houses' doors marked with a fresh red cross, and beneath each cross painted in careful capital letters the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Pepys wrote that evening that it was the first sight of its kind he could remember ever seeing, and that it left him so unsettled about his own health that he rushed out to buy tobacco just so he would have something to chew and smell that might, he hoped, keep the sickness away from him personally. It did not, of course. Nothing quite like that ever really does. And if you have ever caught yourself doing something a little irrational, just to feel a small sense of control during a frightening moment, you already understand exactly what Pepys was feeling that afternoon on Drury Lane. But I think that small, slightly panicked detail tells us almost everything we need to know about a city that, despite already knowing in theory that isolation could slow a plague down, was about to handle its own outbreak in one of the most tragically counterproductive ways imaginable. London in the summer of 1665 was home to something close to 460,000 people, tightly packed into narrow lanes, timber houses leaning into each other overhead until neighbours across the street could practically shake hands from their windows, open gutters running with waste down the middle of most streets. The city had already survived earlier visits from this same sickness in 1603 and several times since, so nobody was entirely unprepared, at least on paper. Charles II sat on the throne freshly restored to power only a handful of years earlier, after England's brief experiment without a monarchy at all. England was busy fighting a naval war with the Dutch, and life for the most part carried on as normal right up until it very suddenly did not. The government's official response once the numbers started climbing was built around a policy that sounded reasonable enough in a council chamber. If plague appeared inside a household, that entire households, sick and healthy alike, would be sealed inside together for 40 days. The very same number, interestingly enough, that a small Adriatic city had settled on nearly 3 centuries earlier for an entirely different purpose. A watchman would be posted at the door to make sure nobody left food, and supplies would be passed in from outside, and the Red Cross with its grim little prayer beneath it would warn every passer-by to keep their distance. Here is the uncomfortable difference worth sitting with for a moment. That earlier Adriatic city had used isolation to keep sickness from ever crossing its threshold in the first place, holding strangers offshore at a careful distance before they were ever allowed anywhere near the healthy population inside the walls. London's law did something almost the opposite. It waited until sickness was already confirmed inside a specific house, sometimes after the illness had been quietly spreading there for days already, and then it locked every healthy person left in that house in there alongside it, sharing the same beds, the same air, the same rats, scurrying along the same floorboards nobody yet understood were the actual problem. A watcher stood outside not to keep sickness out, but to keep the healthy trapped in with it. Have you ever wondered how something can look on paper almost identical to a solution that worked brilliantly somewhere else, and still end up making the exact same crisis considerably worse simply by applying it at the wrong moment to the wrong group of people? Pepys himself never had his own house shut up, and reading his diary now almost 4 centuries later, it is hard not to notice how differently the plague treated people depending on their means. He kept working at the Navy office throughout the entire outbreak, continued attending dinners, kept up at least one affair, celebrated a cousin's wedding, and generally refused to let the surrounding catastrophe interrupt much of anything he actually cared about. By the final week of that terrible year, he wrote something that still catches me off guard every single time I read it. In his own words, he had never lived so merrily as he had done this plague time. He does not mean it callously exactly, or at least I do not think he does. He means it almost confused by his own good fortune, aware that wartime naval contracts had made him considerably wealthier that year, even as thousands of his neighbours only a short walk from his own front door were being carted away in the dark. The poor, of course, had no such luck available to them. When the sickness worsened through July and August, the king and his court packed up and left the city entirely retreating toward Oxford, along with pretty much anyone else who had the money and connections to simply go somewhere else for a few months. The people left behind in London's crowded parishes, the servants, the labourers, the shopkeepers, who could not simply abandon their livelihoods, absorbed almost the entire weight of what followed. And what followed was staggering. Officially, according to the city's weekly bills of mortality, a public record printed and sold on street corners, so ordinary Londoners could track the outbreak for themselves, 68,596 people died of plague in London that year. Most historians studying the surviving records now believe the real number was closer to 100,000 out of a city of only 460,000 people to begin with. That gap between the official count and the likely real one is not simply sloppy record-keeping either. The people responsible for reporting causes of death, mostly older women hired cheaply by each parish and given the grim title of searchers, could often be persuaded quietly sometimes with a small bribe slipped into a waiting palm to write down almost any cause of death other than plague, since a plague diagnosis meant your entire household would immediately be locked inside your own home for the next 40 days. Fear of the cure, in other words, was actively distorting the official record of the disease itself in real time week after week. At night, carts moved slowly through the emptied streets, their drivers calling out the same grim phrase over and over. Bring out your dead collecting bodies for burial in enormous shared pits, dug at the edges of the city, one of the largest at a site called Aldgate. By August, so many were dying that burials could no longer wait for nightfall, and Pepys describes watching funerals happen in broad daylight, something that would have been unthinkable only months before. Most Londoners at the time believed the sickness travelled through what they called bad airfoul vapours, rising from rotting waste and unburied corpses, and much of the official response was built entirely around that mistaken idea. Bonfires burned constantly in public squares meant to purify the atmosphere. Children were actually encouraged to smoke tobacco on the theory that it might cleanse their lungs against infection, and residents were ordered to stay indoors after 9 each evening specifically so that the sick could go outside for fresh air, undisturbed, which is a strange kind of accidental irony, since getting crowded, feverish households out of doors briefly probably did help a little, even though the underlying theory explaining why was almost entirely wrong. Not every response to this outbreak was quite so poorly designed though, and there is one story from that same terrible year I think deserves real attention, because it shows something closer to what Ragusa had figured out centuries earlier, just discovered independently under far more desperate circumstances. In a small village called Ayam tucked into the hills of Derbyshire, plague arrived that same year, reportedly carried in through a bundle of cloth sent from a tailor in London damp fabric that turned out to be carrying infected fleas, along with it laid out near the fire to dry by an unsuspecting assistant who fell ill within days. As the sickness began spreading through the village, the local rector, a man named William Mompesson, made an extraordinary appeal to his neighbours. Rather than fleeing to the surrounding countryside, which almost certainly would have carried the sickness into dozens of other untouched villages nearby, he convinced the people of Ayam to seal themselves inside their own village boundary, voluntarily cutting themselves off entirely from the outside world until the outbreak had fully run its course, whatever the personal cost turned out to be. They held church services outdoors, spaced apart in an open field rather than crowding inside their small stone church. Neighbouring towns left food and supplies at a boundary stone at the edge of the parish, and villagers left coins soaking in vinegar or well water to pay for it out of some instinctive, if scientifically unclear sense that money itself might carry the sickness from hand to hand. Over the following 14 months, roughly 80% of Ayam's population died, including Mompesson's own wife, a loss he had to bury himself in the very churchyard where he continued preaching to whoever remained. But the surrounding villages, as far as historians can tell, were largely spared. I find something quietly remarkable and honestly humbling about that trade. An entire community choosing collective sacrifice with almost no promise of personal survival, purely to protect people they would likely never meet in neighbouring towns. London's government tried to force something similar onto individual households through fear and armed watchmen. Ayam simply agreed to do it themselves, and somehow that difference in approach still says something meaningful about the kind of cooperation fear can force, compared to the kind people occasionally choose freely. By the winter of 1665, plague deaths in London had already begun dropping sharply, likely helped by colder weather, slowing down the fleas responsible for spreading it, something we now understand clearly, but nobody in London could have explained at the time. By February of 1666, the king considered the city safe enough to return to, which brings us to a popular piece of historical folklore I think is worth gently correcting before we move on. Since it gets repeated so often, it has practically become accepted fact. Many people today assume the Great Fire of London, which tore through the city over 5 smoky days in September of 1666, is what finally ended the plague, burning away the infection, along with half the old city in one dramatic, purifying blaze. It makes for a satisfyingly tidy story, the kind that fits neatly into a single sentence. It also is not really true. By the time that fire broke out, the plague had already been fading for the better part of a year, well before a single spark ever caught. And more importantly, the fire itself mostly destroyed the wealthier walled city of London, while many of the worst plague deaths the previous year had actually occurred in poorer parishes. Just outside those walls, places like St Giles in the Fields, areas the flames never even came close to reaching. So why did plague, after visiting England again and again for over 3 centuries, essentially vanish from the country after this outbreak and never seriously return on this scale? Historians still debate the exact answer, and I will be honest with you, there is no single tidy explanation waiting at the end of this particular question. Some researchers point to changing rat populations suggesting a different species may have gradually displaced the black rats, most associated with carrying infected fleas into human homes. Others credit slowly improving quarantine practices at English ports, finally catching up with ideas port cities in the Mediterranean had been quietly using for nearly 300 years by that point. It is entirely possible several smaller factors simply lined up at once, the way they so often seem to throughout this story, each one modest on its own, but decisive once stacked together. What stays with me most from London's version of this story is not really the death toll staggering as it was, but that quiet, uncomfortable gap between knowing what works in theory and actually doing it well under pressure when frightened people and overwhelmed officials are making decisions in real time. By 1665, the basic idea behind quarantine had existed for nearly 300 years, tested and refined across an entire sea's worth of port cities. And still, when the moment actually arrived on London's own doorstep, fear, bureaucracy, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how the sickness actually travelled combined to turn a reasonable idea into a policy that in more than a few homes likely made things measurably worse rather than better. Knowing the right answer, it turns out, has never been quite the same thing as actually being able to act on it in time. It would take almost 2 centuries more and an entirely different disease altogether before anyone finally learned how to do something. London never quite managed that terrible year. Trace an outbreak back not just to a household, but to its exact physical source. One pipe, one pump, one contaminated drop of water at a time. Here is a strange little paradox to sit with as we begin this next stretch of the story. The single most famous act in the entire history of public health. The one-moment textbooks and museum plaques still celebrate above almost any other, happened according to the very man who watched it unfold up close, probably a little too late to actually matter. We will get to exactly what that moment was in a few minutes. But I want you to hold on to that paradox for now, tucked away somewhere in the back of your mind, because I think it says something important about how history actually works. Quietly, messily, full of loose ends compared to how we like to remember it afterward. Tidied up into one clean, satisfying story. By the summer of 1854, London had already lived through cholera twice before, once in 1832 and again in 1849, and the prevailing medical opinion of the time was still firmly convinced that the disease travelled through what everyone called bad air, foul vapours rising from filth and decay. We touched on that exact same mistaken belief earlier tonight, and here it was again nearly 2 centuries later, still shaping how one of the most advanced cities on earth tried to protect itself from an invisible killer. Soho in particular was not a healthy place to live that summer. The neighbourhood had grown crowded and cheap over the previous decades, tenement buildings subdivided again and again to squeeze in more tenants than they were ever designed to hold narrow courtyards stacked 3 and 4 families deep. Roughly half of all households in the area still drained their household waste directly into cesspools, dug beneath or beside their own homes, uncomfortably close to the very wells. Many of those same families drew their drinking water from every single day, without ever pausing to wonder whether the two might be connected. Into this setting stepped a physician named John Snow, a man already fairly well known in London medical circles for entirely different reasons. Only the year before, he had personally administered a new anaesthetic called chloroform to Queen Victoria herself, easing the birth of one of her children, a fact that had made him something of a minor celebrity among London's medical establishment. The sort of physician other doctors already respected, even if they had no idea what he was about to spend the next few weeks obsessing over. But privately, Snow had been quietly fixated on a very different question for years. one that had nothing to do with anesthesia at all. Back in 1849, he had published an essay arguing that cholera was not spread through the air the way nearly every respected physician of his era assumed, but through contaminated water. Instead, an idea that was met in his own later description, with something close to scorn from most of his professional peers. Then, in the final days of August 1854, cholera exploded through the streets round Broad Street in Soho, with a speed that shocked even people who'd already lived through 2 previous outbreaks in living memory. Within about 10 days, more than 500 people died within a quarter-mile of that one street, an area small enough to walk across in a matter of minutes doorstep to doorstep. Whole households were wiped out within hours of the first symptom appearing healthy in the morning and gone by nightfall. Snow himself later wrote that he did not believe any other catastrophe in the country's history, even the plague we spoke about earlier tonight in the streets of this very same city, had ever killed so many people so quickly in such a small contained space. Snow did something almost nobody else investigating the outbreak thought to try. Rather than simply counting bodies, he went door to door asking each grieving family a single deceptively simple question. "Where did you get your water?" And then he did something else, something that feels almost obvious to us now, but was remarkably unusual at the time. He drew a map. Onto a simple street plan of the neighbourhood, he marked a small black bar for every single cholera death, placed directly at the address where it occurred. As those bars accumulated day after day, a pattern began emerging that was impossible to ignore once you actually looked at it laid out visually, rather than buried inside pages of written reports. The deaths clustered thickly, densely, almost suffocatingly around one single object. A public water pump on Broad Street. Have you ever noticed how a pattern that seems invisible in a list of numbers can suddenly become undeniable the moment somebody simply draws it out in front of you? What truly made Snow's case, though, were not just the deaths clustered around that pump, but the places where death was strangely conspicuously absent, almost as if some invisible boundary had been drawn around them on purpose. A workhouse stood just around the corner from the pump housing, over 500 inmates crammed into close quarters, exactly the kind of place you would expect a waterborne disease to devastate first. Only 5 of them died. Snow discovered the workhouse had its own separate well on the premises and rarely sent for water from Broad Street at all. Nearby, a brewery employing more than 70 workers reported not a single cholera death among its staff, not one in a neighbourhood where entire households a few doors down were being wiped out within a day or two. It turned out brewery workers drank almost nothing but the beer they made themselves throughout the working day, and the brewery drew whatever water it did need from a private well of its own as well. Access to clean water, or the lack of it, was drawing an almost perfect outline around who lived and who did not, as though somebody had traced it with a ruler. Then came the case that Snow himself considered nearly impossible to explain any other way. 2 people died of cholera in the quiet, leafy suburb of Hampstead, several miles from Soho, entirely an area with no obvious connection to the outbreak whatsoever. One of them, a widow named Susanna Ely, had once lived on Broad Street years earlier before moving away, but she'd grown so fond of the taste of that particular pump's water that her family kept sending bottles of it out to her regularly. Her final delivery arrived on the 31st of August. She died 2 days later. Her niece, visiting from another part of London, entirely drank some of that same water during her visit, and died as well. I have to admit there is something almost unbearably ironic about that particular detail. A woman who had deliberately moved away from the danger years in advance still managed to have it delivered directly to her front door simply because she liked how it tasted. On the 7th of September, Snow presented his findings, including that map, to the local parish authorities. According to a doctor who was present at that meeting, nobody believed him, not one member of his own profession in the room, and not a single official from the parish either. And yet the very next day, the 7th of September, the board agreed to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump anyway, simply to be safe even while remaining largely unconvinced by his theory. This is the moment nearly every retelling of this story treats as the dramatic turning point, the single decisive act that stopped a killer in its tracks. And here's where we circle back to that paradox I mentioned at the very start. By the time the handle came off that pump, the outbreak had in fact already been declining sharply for several days. Terrified residents had been fleeing the neighbourhood in droves since late August, and the epidemic quite simply was already running out of new people close enough to the pump left to infect. Removing the handle almost certainly did not single-handedly stop the outbreak that had already devastated the neighbourhood, no matter how satisfying that version of the story sounds. But here is the part I think actually matters more, and it comes to us through a second character in this story, who rarely gets equal billing even though he probably deserves it just as much as Snow does. A young local curate named Henry Whitehead had initially been deeply sceptical of Snow's theory, sceptical enough that he set out on his own independent investigation, specifically hoping to disprove it, confident that a more thorough inquiry would expose the flaws in Snow's reasoning. Whitehead knew the Broad Street residents personally in a way an outside physician visiting from elsewhere in London never fully could, having spent years building trust with families in the parish through his regular pastoral visits. Through his own patient, methodical door-to-door work, he uncovered something Snow had not yet pieced together on his own. A 5-month-old infant named Francis Lewis, living directly across from the pump, had fallen ill and died in the very first days of the outbreak, before almost anyone else in the neighbourhood had gotten sick at all. Her mother, following an entirely ordinary domestic routine that any parent of a sick infant would recognise instantly, had washed the baby's soiled linens and emptied that wastewater into a cesspool right in front of their home, a cesspool that, as later engineering inspection confirmed, sat cracked and leaking, barely a few feet from the wall of the Broad Street well itself. Whitehead, the very man who had set out to prove Snow wrong, ended up handing him the single missing piece that completed the entire case, an outcome I doubt either man expected when this whole inquiry began. And he noticed something else too, something quietly important that easily could have gone unrecorded entirely. On the 8th of September, the exact same day the pump handle was finally removed, the baby's own father fell ill with cholera as well, having slept in the very same room. Whitehead later wrote that even if removing that handle had done nothing to stop an outbreak that had already run most of its course, it had almost certainly prevented a fresh new wave from beginning all over again right at that same infected household on that very same day the handle came off. So the popular version of this story is not exactly wrong. It is simply incomplete the way so many popular versions of history tend to be once you look closely enough. The handle did not defeat an outbreak already fading on its own. It closed a door that was still quietly dangerously open. Even after all of this, acceptance did not come quickly or easily. And I think that is worth pausing on because we like to imagine scientific breakthroughs land instantly, with everyone immediately convinced the moment the evidence appears. Snow's theory continued facing serious resistance from much of the medical establishment for years afterward, and some contemporaries pointed out fairly enough that his case had real gaps still worth questioning. Chemical analysis of the pump water at the time actually showed nothing obviously wrong with it under the microscopes available in 1854. Nobody could yet explain why the outbreak's intensity seemed to fade after roughly a week, since the actual bacterium responsible would not be properly identified for decades to come, well after Snow himself was gone. Snow was in the end working with careful observation and an unusually disciplined kind of reasoning, not yet with the biological proof that would eventually confirm he'd been right all along. He died in 1858, only a few years after that outbreak, without ever fully seeing his theory accepted by the medical world he had spent his career trying to convince. Does it ever strike you as a little unfair how often the people who turn out to be right are not believed until long after it would have actually helped them to be? I think that particular question is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Being right, it turns out, is not always the same thing as being believed, and sometimes those two things arrive decades apart from each other, long after the person who did the difficult work of being right first is no longer around to hear anyone admit it. What Snow left behind, though, reshaped how humanity would study every outbreak that came after his. That simple map of black bars clustered around one pump is still taught today as one of the founding images of an entire scientific field, the careful, patient practice of tracing disease not through guesswork or ancient superstition, but through evidence gathered door by door, symptom by symptom, and yes, occasionally one oddly devoted widow's taste for a particular pump's water at a time. Snow had shown the world something remarkable: how to trace a disease backward after it had already taken hold to its exact physical source. But there is an even more powerful trick than tracing sickness after the fact, and remarkably, one small piece of that trick had already been discovered generations before Snow was even born, using nothing more sophisticated than a milkmaid's unblemished skin, a farm, and one doctor's willingness to ask an unusual question nobody else had thought seriously to ask. A milkmaid's unblemished skin. That is where we left off, and I promised we would come back to it, so let us finish that thought properly, rather than leaving it hanging the way a lesser story might. For generations in the dairy counties of rural England, a strange little saying passed between farmhands, and milkmaids repeated so often around kitchen tables and market stalls that most educated physicians simply dismissed it as harmless country superstition, the kind of thing polite society nodded along to and quietly ignored. "I shall never have smallpox," the saying went, "for I have had cowpox." Nobody in a position of medical authority took it seriously for a very long time. But one country doctor, a man we will properly meet again in just a few minutes, could not quite stop thinking about it, turning the idea over in his mind long after most of his colleagues had moved on to more respectable concerns. Before we get to him, though, I think it matters enormously that we understand exactly what kind of monster these milkmaids were claiming, almost casually, to be immune to. Smallpox is without much competition one of the most devastating diseases human beings have ever lived alongside, and unlike almost everything else we've discussed together tonight, this one was not caused by a bacterium hiding in a flea or a contaminated well. It was a virus spread directly from person to person, through the air, through touch, through the fluid inside its own telltale pustules, killing somewhere around 3 out of every 10 people it infected, and permanently scarring or blinding a great many of those who survived it. Entire faces, once smooth and familiar, were left permanently marked, which is part of why for centuries a childhood free of visible pockmarks was considered something worth commenting on, almost worth celebrating in a way that feels remarkably strange to imagine today. And nowhere in recorded history did this particular disease do more damage more quickly to more people than when it crossed the Atlantic Ocean for the very first time. When Spanish ships began arriving on the shores of what is now Mexico in the early 1500s, they carried something far more devastating than steel swords or gunpowder, something nobody at the time could see coming, because nobody yet understood that diseases could be carried inside a person who showed no symptoms at all. The people of the Americas had lived for thousands of years completely isolated from this specific virus, which meant they had no inherited resistance to it whatsoever, none of the partial immunity that centuries of exposure had slowly built into European populations. In the year 1520, smallpox reached Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire, a city built on an island in the middle of a lake connected to the mainland by great causeways, larger and by most contemporary accounts considerably cleaner and more orderly than most cities in Europe at the time. The timing could not have been more catastrophic. Spanish forces under Hernán Cortés had just been violently driven out of the city during an uprising retreating in what became known afterward as a night of great sorrow, and as they regrouped outside the walls to plan their return, smallpox quietly slipped in ahead of them, moving through a population with absolutely no defence against it. Within months, by some estimates, close to half the city's inhabitants were dead streets and canals choked with bodies faster than survivors could manage proper burial. The Aztec emperor who had taken power during that chaos, a capable and determined leader named Cuitlahuac, died of the disease after ruling for less than 3 months, leaving the empire suddenly catastrophically leaderless, at the exact moment it most needed steady, experienced direction. Have you ever wondered how differently world history might read today if a single virus had not arrived at that one particular city in that one particular year? I want to be careful here because this is not a simple story and I do not think it deserves a simple telling. Historians still debate the precise numbers, and the fall of the Aztec Empire cannot be reduced to disease alone. It involved siege warfare and Cortés's alliances with rival indigenous nations, who had their own long-standing grievances against Aztec rule, and a great deal of brutal, deliberate violence carried out by human hands, not viral particles. But nearly every serious historian studying this period agrees on one thing. Smallpox arrived at precisely the moment it could do the most damage, hollowing out leadership, weakening defenders, and creating exactly the kind of chaos that allowed a comparatively small foreign force to help topple an empire of millions. Across the wider Americas in the century or so that followed, wave after wave of smallpox, along with measles, typhus, and other diseases that travelled alongside European contact, are estimated by many historians to have killed the overwhelming majority of the indigenous population, a demographic catastrophe with almost no equal anywhere else in recorded history, reshaping entire continents before most of the people living there had ever even seen a European face in person. That is the scale of the enemy those milkmaids in rural England were casually claiming not to fear. So where did the actual solution first come from? Not from a laboratory, and not, as it turns out, from Europe at all, at least not originally. Long before entire cultures scattered across Africa, the Ottoman Empire, India and China had already been practicing a much older, cruder method of protection, called inoculation or variolation, deliberately introducing a small controlled amount of matter from a smallpox sore into a healthy person, hoping to trigger a milder case that would grant lasting immunity afterward. It was risky. It occasionally killed the very person it was meant to protect. But statistically, it killed far fewer people than catching the disease naturally ever did. In 1716, an enslaved African man named Onesimus, living in Boston, and owned by a Puritan minister named Cotton Mather, described this exact practice to Mather in detail, explaining how it had been performed for generations back in his own homeland in West Africa, complete with the small scar it left behind on the arm as proof of protection. Mather, initially sceptical of anything sounding this unfamiliar, would go on to champion the method during a serious smallpox outbreak in Massachusetts 5 years later, facing considerable public hostility for doing so, including threats from neighbours who found the entire idea reckless and foreign. It was a decision that likely saved a considerable number of lives built on knowledge that had travelled to America not through any European medical journal or royal court, but through the memory of a man robbed of his own freedom, carrying real medical knowledge that the society enslaving him had no idea it desperately needed, Around that same time, an English aristocrat named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was living in Constantinople, where her husband served as ambassador to the Ottoman court. Lady Mary had personal reasons to care deeply about this particular disease, reasons far more intimate than simple scholarly curiosity. Smallpox had killed her own brother, a young man in the prime of his life, and had left her own once-celebrated face permanently scarred only a few years earlier, a loss she wrote about with real unguarded grief. In Constantinople, she watched local women perform the same kind of inoculation. Onesimus had described half a world away, something she called engrafting in her letters home, and in 1718 she made the extraordinary decision to have her own 5-year-old son treated this way entirely on the strength of what she had personally witnessed with her own eyes. When she returned to England, she became something close to a one-woman campaign, having her own daughter inoculated publicly in 1721 during a fresh outbreak, and eventually persuading royal physicians to test the method further before recommending it to the royal family itself. That same year, in an ethically uncomfortable chapter of this story that deserves to be told honestly, rather than politely skipped over, several condemned prisoners at Newgate were offered their freedom in exchange for being inoculated as an open trial, a bargain struck between desperation and curiosity that would raise serious ethical alarm bells today. When none of them developed smallpox afterward, the method's reputation in England began slowly and reluctantly to shift in her favour. Lady Mary faced fierce resistance from much of London's medical establishment throughout all of this. Some of it rooted in simple scepticism, and some of it by her own account rooted in something closer to professional self-interest. Physicians reluctant to embrace a foreign low-cost technique that threatened a profitable established set of treatments. This is where our milkmaid finally re-enters the story. A country doctor named Edward Jenner, working in the county of Gloucestershire, had grown thoroughly convinced there was real truth buried inside that old dairy country, saying, unlike most of his more dismissive colleagues, cowpox was a much milder disease that occasionally passed from infected cattle to the hands of the people who milked them, causing a modest, uncomfortable sore rather than a body-wide catastrophe. And Jenner suspected that surviving this milder illness might somehow train the body to recognize and resist its far more dangerous relative. It is worth asking honestly how many other doctors of his era had heard that exact same milkmaid saying over the years and simply never thought to test it. In May of 1796, a young dairymaid named Sarah Nelmes came to Jenner with a fresh cowpox sore on her hand caught as it happened from a cow her father owned. Jenner took a small amount of matter from that sore and used it to inoculate an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps, the son of his own gardener, making 2 shallow scratches on the child's arm. Phipps grew mildly unwell for a few days, developing a slight fever and a loss of appetite, then recovered fully within the week. Several weeks later, Jenner did something that by any modern ethical standard we would rightly refuse to permit today. He deliberately exposed the same child to actual smallpox matter testing, whether the boy's body would now resist the far deadlier disease entirely. It did. Phipps never developed so much as a single symptom. I think it is worth sitting honestly with both halves of that moment at once, rather than reaching for the comfortable version of this story that so many textbooks prefer. It was a genuine turning point in the history of human medicine, arguably one of the most important single afternoons in that entire history. And it was also an experiment performed on a poor, powerless child who almost certainly had very little real say in the matter, exactly the kind of person history has repeatedly asked to carry the risk for discoveries that would eventually benefit everyone else, including people far wealthier and safer than he ever was. Progress and exploitation once again sitting far closer together in this story than most of us would like to admit, holding hands in the very same garden. When Jenner submitted his findings to the Royal Society, they rejected his paper outright, warning him that such an unbelievable claim risked destroying his professional reputation entirely if he continued pursuing it publicly. He kept working anyway, testing the idea further on several more children over the following 2 years, before finally publishing his findings himself in 1798, unwilling to let one dismissive committee bury an idea he had already watched work with his own eyes. He called the method vaccination, borrowing the Latin word for cauvaca, in quiet tribute to where the entire idea had ultimately come from, a small farmyard word that would eventually enter every language on Earth. It would take nearly 2 centuries more, but the principle Jenner demonstrated in that small English garden eventually spread across the entire world, refined, standardized, and distributed on a scale he could never have possibly imagined from his quiet corner of Gloucestershire. In 1980, the World Health Organization formally declared smallpox completely eradicated, the only human disease we have ever managed to erase entirely from the planet through deliberate coordinated human effort. A sickness that had haunted humanity for thousands of years, that helped topple an empire that scarred queens and peasants with equal indifference, simply does not exist in nature anymore. We ended it deliberately together, using little more than an old country saying nobody in power wanted to believe at first, carried forward by an enslaved man's memory, a grieving noblewoman's stubbornness, and one country doctor's willingness to finally test what everyone else had simply ignored. Doesn't it feel strange in a good way to spend an entire night walking through catastrophe after catastrophe, and finally arrive at one single story that actually ends with total permanent victory? We have spent tonight walking through outbreak after outbreak that humanity mostly endured, reacted to, or occasionally traced back to its source after the damage had already been done. This is the first time in our whole story where humanity actually reached forward and closed a door before the monster on the other side ever got the chance to walk through it. That distinction matters, and it would matter again in an entirely different kind of crisis, barely more than a century later, when an ordinary autumn suddenly turned into one of the deadliest seasons the modern world had ever experienced. An ordinary autumn. That is exactly how I described what was coming, and I want to start by asking you to picture something extremely small and extremely unremarkable, because that is actually how this next catastrophe truly began. Not with an army, not with a ship full of frightened refugees, not even with a single dramatic outbreak anyone at the time thought worth remembering. Just one tired country doctor and a handful of patients who seemed a little sicker than they should have been. In the flat, windswept farming country of southwestern Kansas, in the final winter weeks of a war already grinding through its 4th exhausting year, a country doctor named Loring Minor started noticing something odd among his patients. This was not the usual seasonal cough and fever he had treated for decades of quiet rural practice. Strong, healthy adults, farmers in the prime of their lives, people who rarely bothered seeing a doctor at all, were being knocked flat within hours by violent headaches and fevers so severe some of them died within days. Minor was concerned enough to alert federal health officials, an unusual step for a small-town practitioner to take. Almost nobody outside his own county paid much attention. It was, after all, just one doctor in one remote corner of one state describing an illness that sounded on paper like nothing more than an especially rough flu season. A few weeks later, at a nearby army training camp called Camp Funston, an army cook, a young private whose name history has actually preserved, reported to the infirmary complaining of a headache and a fever, entirely unaware he was about to become one of the most consequential patients of the entire century. Within 3 weeks, more than 1,100 soldiers at that single camp had come down with the same illness. And because it was 1918, and young men were being funneled by the tens of thousands through camps exactly like this one, then packed onto crowded troop ships bound for the trenches of a war still very much underway, that small, unremarkable illness found itself the most efficient travel companion imaginable, riding alongside soldiers across an ocean and straight into the heart of a continent already exhausted by 4 years of fighting. Here is a fact that still catches people off guard almost every time I mention it. Historians generally agree this pandemic likely began somewhere in the American heartland, not in the country, whose name it still carries to this day. So why do we still call it the Spanish flu? The answer has almost nothing to do with medicine, and almost everything to do with wartime censorship. Every major power fighting in 1918, including the country where this illness most likely began, was actively suppressing news that might damage civilian morale or hint at military weakness to the enemy. Newspapers in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany largely stayed quiet about the illness spreading rapidly through their own training camps and trenches. Spain, however, had remained neutral throughout the entire war, which meant Spanish newspapers faced no such wartime restrictions. When the King of Spain himself fell seriously ill with the disease in the spring of 1918, it made front-page news across the country openly and repeatedly. To the rest of a heavily censored world reading only what their own governments allowed into print, it truly looked as though Spain was the epicenter of something the rest of the world had somehow avoided. Spanish health officials protested the label almost immediately, one of them writing with a certain understandable irritation that his own country had been just as surprised as everyone else to learn people abroad were calling this the Spanish disease. Have you ever stopped to consider how a name chosen almost entirely by accident can end up shaping how an entire century remembers where a catastrophe actually began? By September of 1918, the illness had mutated into something considerably more lethal than its milder spring version, and it found a devastatingly perfect breeding ground at a place called Camp Devens, roughly 40 miles outside Boston. Built to comfortably hold around 35,000 soldiers, Devens was packed with closer to 50,000 men. That September, all of them awaiting deployment to Europe, sleeping in close quarters, sharing mess halls, sharing everything a training camp forces strangers to share. The outbreak hit with a speed that overwhelmed even experienced military doctors. The first case appeared on the 7th of September, a soldier admitted screaming in pain, initially misdiagnosed as meningitis. Within a day, a dozen more men from his unit had followed him into the sick ward. On a single day at the peak of the crisis, over 1,500 soldiers reported to sick call at once, a number that would overwhelm almost any modern hospital, let alone a military infirmary built for a fraction of that load. A young army physician stationed there, known to us today only by his first name Roy, since his original letter was rediscovered decades later, inside an old trunk without any further identifying details ever surfacing, wrote to a doctor friend describing what he was witnessing in language that still reads like something out of a nightmare. Men arrived looking like an ordinary case of the flu, he wrote, and then rapidly developed what he called the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. Their cheekbones would darken into a strange mahogany-coloured bruising within hours, spreading until their skin turned a deep, suffocating blue, so pronounced that Roy wrote it became difficult to tell men of different races apart by the time the disease had finished with them. He was recording roughly 100 deaths a day at that single camp alone, watching fellow doctors and nurses collapse from the very same illness they were desperately trying to treat, until there were barely enough healthy hands left standing to carry the bodies out. There is something about reading a letter like that written by an exhausted, frightened young doctor who had no idea his private words would still be read by strangers more than a century later, that feels far more immediate to me than any official casualty report ever could. This particular strain of influenza had one deeply unusual, deeply cruel feature that set it apart from almost every other flu outbreak in recorded history. Ordinary seasonal influenza is typically most dangerous to the very young and the very old people whose immune systems are naturally weaker. This one killed enormous numbers of healthy adults in their 20s and 30s, the exact population you would expect to weather a normal flu with barely a missed day of work. Modern researchers now believe the answer lies in something called a cytokine storm, a situation where an unusually strong healthy immune system essentially overreacts to the infection so violently that it ends up drowning its own lungs in inflammation and fluid, turning the body's own defenses into the actual cause of death. In other words, in one of history's crueler ironies, having an unusually strong immune system may have actually made this particular disease more dangerous, not less. With so many male doctors already deployed overseas as army physicians, the burden of caring for this catastrophe at home fell overwhelmingly onto nurses, the vast majority of them women working impossibly long shifts in makeshift hospitals, set up inside gymnasiums, armories, and school auditoriums that had never been designed to hold a single patient, let alone hundreds. Nursing organizations across the country found themselves desperately short-staffed, almost overnight training ordinary volunteers with only the briefest instruction, just to have enough hands to change linens, take temperatures, and simply sit with the dying, so that nobody had to face those final hours completely alone. Many of those nurses caught the illness themselves working sick for as long as their bodies allowed, rather than abandon patients who had nobody else left, to turn to a quiet, largely uncelebrated form of courage that rarely made it into the history books alongside the soldiers fighting an ocean away. Public response to the outbreak varied enormously from city to city across the United States, and comparing two of them side by side tells you almost everything you need to know about how much individual decisions mattered in the middle of a crisis nobody fully understood yet. In Philadelphia City, health officials downplayed the danger even as cases climbed steadily through September, publicly assuring residents that soldiers at the Naval Yard were only suffering from an ordinary seasonal bout of flu, easily managed by staying warm and keeping dry feet. Despite urgent warnings from local doctors who begged the city to postpone a massive parade already scheduled to promote government war bonds, officials refused to budge. On the 28th of September, roughly 200,000 people packed the streets of downtown Philadelphia, shoulder to shoulder, cheering on marching bands and soldiers for 2 solid miles, exactly the kind of tightly packed public gathering that public health experts today would recognize immediately as a disaster waiting to happen. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in the city was full. Within 6 weeks, more than 12,000 Philadelphians were dead, with total losses eventually climbing well past 16,000 by the time the wave finally passed. Doesn't it feel almost unbearably familiar watching officials choose reassurance over caution, and then watching the consequences arrive exactly on schedule anyway? Just a few hundred miles away in St. Louis, the city's health commissioner made an almost entirely opposite decision the moment cases began appearing. Schools, theatres, sporting events, and public gatherings of nearly every kind were shut down almost immediately, within roughly a day of the first confirmed civilian cases, well before the outbreak had a chance to gain any real momentum in the city. St. Louis, one of the largest cities in the country at the time, ended the entire epidemic with a death rate roughly 1/8 the size of Philadelphia's a Gap, researchers studying this exact comparison decades later would point to again and again as one of history's clearest demonstrations of how much timing alone can matter. Same disease, same nation, same autumn. Two entirely different outcomes separated almost entirely by how quickly and how seriously local leadership chose to act. By the time this pandemic finally burned itself out in 1919, it had infected somewhere around 1/3 of the entire global population, roughly 500 million people out of a world of under 2 billion, and killed by most modern estimates somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, a range so wide it tells you something on its own about how difficult accurate record keeping became once entire nations were simultaneously fighting a war and a pandemic at the same time. To put that number beside something, we can actually measure it against the First World War itself, the very conflict this illness spread alongside, and often travelled faster than killed, somewhere around 20 million people. Soldiers and civilians combined across 4 brutal years of trench warfare, artillery and famine. This illness matched or exceeded that entire toll in roughly the same span of time, and in some countries the flu alone killed more people than the war had. And yet, strangely, for most of the 20th century afterward, this pandemic occupied almost no space, in popular memory overshadowed almost completely by the war it rode alongside. Families rarely spoke of it even to their own children and grandchildren. It appeared for decades as barely a footnote in most history books, dwarfed by battles and treaties and the fall of empires, even though it had by almost any honest measure been considerably deadlier than all of them combined. Memorials to fallen soldiers rose in nearly every town square across the involved nations. Almost nowhere by comparison was there ever a memorial built specifically for the far larger number of people quietly lost to influenza that same year. I've wondered about that quite a bit, honestly. Maybe a war has a story you can tell afterward with villains and victories and a clear ending everyone can point to on a map or a calendar. A pandemic just sort of arrives, does unbearable damage without any real narrative shape to it. No enemy flag to blame, no treaty to sign when it finally ends and then eventually fades away, leaving behind only exhausted survivors who understandably mostly just wanted to stop thinking about it and get on with whatever life remained to them. Sickness, it turns out, does not always need a name we remember correctly, or a story we tell our grandchildren to still reshape the entire world quietly behind the scenes. Sometimes the deadliest events in human history are also somehow among the easiest for us to simply forget, filed away under a mislabeled name, waiting patiently for someone generations later to finally sit down and tell it properly. Not every disease that reshaped this next century moved through crowded army camps or city parades, though. The next one we need to talk about moved through something far more intimate and far more quietly terrifying to an entire generation of parents. It moved through swimming pools and summer afternoons, and the small, ordinary bodies of children who had done nothing more dangerous than go outside to play on a warm July day. Swimming pools closed and drained in the middle of a heat wave. Movie theatres sitting empty on a Saturday afternoon that should have been packed with children. Mothers pulling their sons and daughters back from a drinking fountain they would have used without a second thought only a summer earlier. Scanning crowded parks with a kind of watchfulness that never fully switched off between June and September. That is the world we're stepping into now, and I promised you. Children playing outside on an ordinary July afternoon, so let's begin there properly. For much of the middle of the 20th century, American parents lived through something strange and specific every single summer, a fear that arrived reliably with warm weather and left just as reliably once the leaves began turning. The disease responsible was polio, and here is the detail I find almost impossible to wrap my head around even now. This particular sickness became more dangerous, not less, as everyday hygiene improved. For most of human history, infants were exposed to this virus extremely early in life, usually while still carrying some borrowed protection from their mother's own antibodies, and the resulting infection passed almost unnoticed, mild enough that a family might never even realize their child had encountered it at all, dismissed as nothing more than a fussy day or two. But as running water, indoor plumbing, and general cleanliness spread through wealthier households in the early 1900s, that early gentle exposure simply stopped happening for many children. The virus itself did not go anywhere, and it certainly did not grow any weaker. It simply waited longer to find its first victim, striking older children and even young adults instead, whose bodies without that early practice run their grandparents' generation had received almost by accident, were now considerably more likely to develop the disease's most severe paralyzing form. In other words, the very cleanliness that had protected earlier generations from cholera and typhoid, the same kind of progress we spent time with earlier tonight, quietly opened a door for something else entirely. Have you ever considered how a single well-intentioned improvement, cleaner homes, safer water, could accidentally hand an old enemy a completely new opportunity? When the virus did attack the nervous system severely, it could paralyze the muscles controlling breathing itself, leaving otherwise conscious, alert patients unable to draw a single breath on their own, trapped fully awake inside a body that had simply stopped cooperating. In 1928, two researchers at Harvard, Philip Drinker and Louis Agassiz Shaw, built a solution, an enormous airtight metal cylinder that enclosed a patient's entire body, except for their head, powered at first by nothing more sophisticated than an electric motor, borrowed from a pair of vacuum cleaners using a motor-driven pump to rhythmically change the air pressure inside and force the lungs to expand and contract almost like a bellows. Patients called it the iron lung, and for those whose breathing muscles had failed completely, it meant the difference between living and suffocating within minutes. Some spent only a week or two inside one before recovering enough to breathe unaided again. Others spent months, occasionally years, lying flat inside a machine, able to see the world only through a small mirror angled above their head, reflecting whatever happened to be going on in the room behind them, their meals, their visitors, their entire remaining social life filtered through a few inches of angled glass. I try to imagine that specifically being fully aware, fully present and reduced to watching your own life pass by second hand through a mirror, because your own chest has simply stopped listening to you. Few Americans understood this fear more personally than a man who would go on to lead the country through some of its darkest years. In the summer of 1921, a wealthy, ambitious 39-year-old politician named Franklin Roosevelt contracted polio while vacationing at his family's summer home and lost the use of his legs permanently within a matter of days, a shockingly fast collapse for a man who'd been swimming and sailing just that same week. For the remainder of his political career, including his eventual 12 years as president, Roosevelt worked extraordinarily hard to keep the full extent of his paralysis hidden from public view, relying on heavy steel leg braces locked at the knee, careful staging that always placed him already seated or standing before cameras arrived, and an unspoken agreement with most photographers of the era who quietly declined to photograph him being carried or wheeled from place to place. It is a strange, complicated thing to sit with, a man leading an entire nation through economic collapse and world war, while working just as hard privately and quietly to convince that same nation he could still simply stand on his own 2 feet. In 1938, Roosevelt channeled that experience into something concrete, founding an organization that would eventually be known to nearly every American household as the March of Dimes, urging ordinary citizens, radio listeners, moviegoers, schoolchildren, emptying their own pockets to mail the White House a single dime each toward polio research. It worked far beyond anyone's expectations. Letters containing dimes arrived by the truckload, so many that White House staff reportedly struggled at times just to process the volume of mail. By the early 1950s, the campaign was raising tens of millions of dollars a year, one small coin at a time, funding laboratories, hospitals, and rehabilitation centers across the entire country, including the very research that would eventually end the disease altogether. It remains even now one of the clearest examples in American history of ordinary people individually contributing almost nothing, collectively financing a scientific breakthrough that no single government budget of that era had been willing to fully commit to on its own. That funding eventually found its way to a research scientist in Pittsburgh named Jonas Salk, who had grown convinced that a vaccine made from a carefully killed deactivated version of the virus could train the body's immune system without ever risking a genuine infection at all. Most of Salk's own scientific peers believed this approach was fundamentally wrong, insisting from decades of established practice that only a weakened but still living virus could produce lasting protection. Salk pressed forward anyway, testing his early vaccine first on laboratory animals, then in a detail that still strikes me as almost unbelievably personal for a man about to become a national hero on himself, his wife and his own 3 young sons mixing the doses and boiling his needles and syringes on the family stove in their own kitchen, before injecting his own children with something no human being had ever safely received before, with no guarantee whatsoever that it would work. That is either an extraordinary act of scientific confidence, or a father who simply could not bring himself to ask other people's children to risk something he was not willing to risk with his own first. I suspect, honestly, it was probably both at once in roughly equal measure. Salk's chief rival, a virologist named Albert Sabin, was pursuing an entirely different strategy, a live but deliberately weakened version of the virus administered orally rather than by injection, which he believed would ultimately provide stronger, more lasting protection. The two men did not simply disagree scientifically. They came to truly dislike each other, and Sabin was not shy about saying so publicly, reportedly dismissing Salk's work at one point by saying anyone could go into a kitchen and do what he had done, a jab clearly meant to sting rather than merely critique. In the spring of 1954, Salk's vaccine underwent what remains even today one of the largest medical experiments ever conducted anywhere in the world, involving nearly 2 million American schoolchildren across dozens of states. Volunteers who took part were proudly nicknamed polio pioneers, given a small pin and a certificate for their trouble sent home to parents who had in many cases been waiting years for exactly this kind of opportunity to protect their own families, while researchers meticulously tracked every single case, using nothing more sophisticated than paper forms and room-sized punch card computers, an entire nation's worth of childhood health data, processed largely by hand. On the 12th of April 1955 at the University of Michigan, the man overseeing that massive trial stood before a room full of waiting doctors and a closed-circuit television broadcast and announced the results. The vaccine was safe, effective, and dependable against every strain of the disease being tracked. Church bells rang out across entire cities, factories sounded their whistles in celebration, and strangers reportedly embraced each other on street corners, the way people had at the end of a war, some literally weeping with relief right there in public. Newspapers compared the mood in the streets to the end of a war, outright a comparison that once you understand how many summers this disease had quietly stolen from an entire generation of parents, no longer feels like much of an exaggeration at all. That same evening, a television interviewer asked Salk, almost in passing, who actually owned the patent to his discovery. Salk's answer became one of the most quoted lines in the history of medicine. "There is no patent," he said. "Could you patent the sun?" I do not think that line was quite as simple as it sounds when people repeat it today. Salk's own foundation had in fact looked into patenting the vaccine beforehand, and lawyers ultimately concluded there was likely no patentable novelty to claim in the first place, since his method built directly on techniques other researchers had already developed. But whatever the exact legal reasoning behind it, the outcome mattered enormously in practice. A treatment that could have generated an almost unimaginable fortune instead reached hospitals and clinics around the entire world within just a few short years. The triumph, though, was not entirely clean, and I think that detail deserves honest mention rather than quiet omission, the way so many of the celebration stories tend to leave it out entirely. Within weeks of the announcement, several batches of vaccine manufactured by one particular company were later found to contain live dangerous virus due to a manufacturing failure that safety inspection should have caught, and did not. Roughly 200 children who received those specific contaminated batches developed polio as a direct result, several of them fatally, a devastating outcome for families who had lined up, hopefully trusting the very system meant to protect them. The flaw traced back to inadequate industrial oversight rather than any error in Salk's original formula, and public health officials moved quickly to correct it once the pattern became clear. But the incident briefly shook public confidence at the very moment celebration had felt most complete, a sober reminder that even our greatest medical victories rarely arrive without some cost attached, paid by people who never asked to carry it. Within just a few years of that April afternoon, polio cases in the United States had collapsed by more than 90%, from tens of thousands of cases a year down to a small fraction of that, a decline so steep that entire hospital wards once dedicated to polio patients simply closed their doors within a single decade. Sabin's rival oral vaccine tested at scale in the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. Of all places, an unlikely pocket of scientific cooperation, quietly persisting underneath decades of political hostility between the two nations, arrived not long after, and eventually became the preferred version used across much of the world, easier to administer, dropped onto a sugar cube, rather than delivered by needle requiring no trained medical staff standing by to give it. Here is something worth sitting with as we close this particular chapter. Historians who have studied public reaction during these years point out that polio, terrifying as it clearly was, actually killed and disabled far fewer children each year than car accidents or childhood cancer did during that exact same period. What made it so uniquely frightening was not simply its death toll, but its complete unpredictability, arriving without warning, apparently at random, capable of transforming a healthy child into a paralyzed one, within the span of a single afternoon with no obvious cause a worried parent could point to and simply avoid. Does it surprise you at all, thinking back over everything we've covered tonight, how rarely the disease that actually kills the most people turns out to be the one everyone remembers being most afraid of? Fear, it turns out, rarely scales itself to match the actual statistics sitting quietly in some official report somewhere. It scales to match how helpless a threat makes us feel while we are waiting powerless for it to choose its next target. We're nearing the final hours of tonight's journey now, and there is one more chapter left to walk through together, one that will feel considerably closer to your own lifetime than almost everything we have covered so far. Close enough that some of what happened you likely remember living through yourself. Some of what happened next you likely remember living through yourself, or at the very least you grew up hearing about it from parents who did told at the dinner table, the way our own grandparents once told stories about wars and hard winters. That alone makes this final stretch of our story feel different from everything that came before it tonight. We're no longer talking about candlelit rooms in Constantinople, or a doctor in a straw hut in Hong Kong, or a general recovering from a fever in ancient Athens. We're talking about the world roughly as you already know it, sometimes uncomfortably close to home. On the 5th of June 1981, a short dry medical bulletin from health officials in the United States described 5 otherwise healthy young men in Los Angeles, all suffering from a rare form of pneumonia, normally seen only in patients with severely damaged immune systems. Almost nobody outside a small circle of doctors noticed the report at first. It ran quietly buried in a publication most ordinary physicians rarely even opened. It would take years and an enormous, unforgivable amount of quiet suffering before the wider world understood that this strange cluster of cases marked the beginning of one of the deadliest pandemics in modern history, a virus we now call HIV and the disease it causes, AIDS. What made this particular crisis so painful beyond the illness itself was how deliberately slow the response often was. Because the disease first became visible primarily among gay men in American cities, it was for years treated by much of the public, and shamefully by some of the very officials meant to respond to it less like a medical emergency and more like a moral judgment, almost a punishment some people quietly believed the sick had somehow earned. Funding lagged for years. Serious research lagged. Some funeral homes reportedly refused to even handle the bodies of the dead, leaving grieving families to search desperately for anyone willing to help them say goodbye properly. Families in painful, quiet ways sometimes turned away from their own children, rather than face what neighbours and relatives around them might think or say. Out of that particular grief in the mid-1980s, a young activist named Cleve Jones helped create something unusually tender in response to something so cruel. After a march honouring victims of an earlier tragedy, he learned that more than 1,000 people in his own city had already died of the disease, and he asked fellow marchers to write the names of friends they had lost onto simple paper placards, then tape them to the wall of a federal building where the overlapping shapes reminded him standing back and looking at the whole wall at once of a patchwork quilt. That image became literal. Volunteers began sewing actual fabric panels, each one roughly the size of a grave stitched by hand, in memory of a specific person, a specific name, a specific life that stigma had tried so hard to render invisible. By the time it was first unfolded on the National Mall in Washington in 1987, it already held nearly 2,000 panels, laid out across a space larger than a football field, while volunteers read every single name aloud. Today it holds tens of thousands and remains one of the largest pieces of community art ever created anywhere on Earth, still growing panel by panel decades later. Effective treatment eventually arrived, though it took distressingly long to reach the people who needed it most, especially outside wealthy countries where access lagged years, sometimes an entire additional decade behind. By the mid-1990s, combinations of antiretroviral medications had transformed what was once an almost certain death sentence into something millions of people now live with as a manageable chronic condition, taking a daily pill rather than counting down remaining months. The virus was never eradicated the way smallpox eventually was, and it still quietly claims lives today in places where treatment remains difficult to reach. But the sheer speed at which fear and judgment outran compassion for years before science and empathy finally managed to catch up together remains one of the more sobering lessons buried inside this entire evening's story. A reminder that the danger is rarely only the disease itself. A different kind of test arrived roughly 3 decades later in the forests of West Africa. In December of 2013, a 2-year-old boy in a small Guinean village fell ill with a fever and died within days. His mother, his sister, and his grandmother soon followed one after another in a pattern nobody in that village had ever encountered before. Nobody yet knew it, but that small, devastating cluster of deaths was the beginning of the largest Ebola outbreak ever recorded, a virus with a mortality rate among the highest of any disease we have discussed tonight, spreading through Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia, largely because of how the virus travelled through direct contact with bodily fluids, including tragically through the traditional funeral practices that called for family members to wash and touch the bodies of their dead as an act of profound love and respect. Health workers estimated that a single funeral for one influential traditional healer, a woman widely trusted across the region, likely led to hundreds of additional infections all on its own. Mourners carrying the virus home with them from a ceremony meant only to honour the dead. For a while, international health responders made the same mistake, variations of which we have watched play out again and again tonight. They tried to simply ban these deeply meaningful funeral customs outright, arriving in unfamiliar protective suits and removing bodies by force, and communities understandably resisted, sometimes hiding the sick, rather than surrendering their loved ones to strangers who seemed to understand nothing about what those rituals actually meant to them. The turning point came only once responders stopped dictating from the outside and started listening instead, working directly with local families, elders and religious leaders to design burial practices that honoured grief and tradition, while still keeping mourners physically safe, allowing viewing at a careful distance, permitting prayers and familiar rituals wherever they could be safely preserved, alongside the necessary precautions. Once that trust was slowly, patiently rebuilt, safe burials rose dramatically across the affected regions, and the epidemic that had once seemed unstoppable was declared over within about 2 years. I think that pattern deserves to sit right alongside everything else we've covered tonight. Solutions imposed from above rarely work as well as solutions built together with the very people actually living through the crisis, no matter how many centuries separate one outbreak from another, no matter how much more advanced our medicine has become in the meantime. Ragusa learned this lesson quietly through trial and error 6 centuries earlier, when a Jewish physician's cautious instincts eventually became official policy rather than being simply overruled by people who outranked him. Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia relearned it the hard way too in real time, with modern equipment and modern science that still could not substitute for something as basic and old-fashioned as trust between neighbours. And then quite recently, nearly all of us lived through a pandemic together, at the exact same time in a way almost nobody alive had ever experienced before, watching the same kind of empty streets, the same kind of closed schools and shuttered shops that we have walked past together tonight in Ragusa and London and Philadelphia, except this time it was our own streets, our own kitchens, our own faces reflected back at us on a screen, instead of in an iron-lunged, small-angled mirror. I do not think tonight is the moment to relitigate every argument that pandemic caused, since plenty of those conversations are still raw, still deeply personal, and still honestly ongoing in living rooms, not unlike wherever you happen to be right now. But I do want to leave you with one detail worth genuine wonder, something that connects directly back to almost everything we spent this evening discussing. Traditional vaccine development, as we spent hours discussing tonight, historically took years, sometimes decades, moving slowly from folk observation to laboratory work, to painstaking trial after painstaking trial, the way it did for Jenna and again for Salk. During this most recent pandemic, using an entirely new kind of vaccine technology, that had actually been quietly developed over decades of careful, unglamorous preparation before anyone urgently needed it. Effective vaccines were designed, tested, and authorized in under a single year. Whatever else gets debated about that period for years to come, that particular achievement compressing what once took a scientific lifetime into a matter of months deserves to be remembered as something remarkable in its own right, sitting at the very end of a chain stretching all the way back to a milkmaid's unblemished hands in Gloucestershire. So here we are at the very end of a long night's journey through roughly 25 centuries of humanity, meeting sickness again and again in Athens, in Constantinople, in Florence, in a small Adriatic port city, in London, in Soho, in Philadelphia, and now in living rooms not so different from wherever you happen to be resting your head right now. If there is one thread I hope you carry with you out of everything we have covered tonight, it is this. The plague itself, whatever form it happened to take in any given century, was never really the whole story. The virus, or the bacteria, or the water, or the flea was only ever half of what actually happened in each of these moments. The whole story every single time was also what human beings chose to do standing right next to it. Some people turned on their neighbours looking for someone convenient to blame. Some hid protecting only the people closest to them, and quietly survived without ever really being tested. And some, again and again across every single century we walked through, tonight chose to run directly toward the suffering instead, sewing a quilt by hand, holding a stranger's hand inside an iron lung boiling needles, on their own kitchen stove to test an unproven vaccine on their own children, first walking door to door with a curate's collar and a notebook, refusing to let a good rumour stand in for the truth. We are all of us still capable of every single one of those responses, even now, even tonight, sitting exactly where you are. History does not really move in a straight line from ignorance toward wisdom, tidy and permanent the way we sometimes like to imagine it, from a comfortable distance. It mostly just keeps handing each new generation the exact same quiet choice their ancestors already faced over and over, in slightly different clothing with slightly better medicine, but the same essential decision waiting underneath it all. Fear or courage, suspicion or trust, turning away or walking closer. Do you remember that small detail from the very beginning of tonight's story? The little oil lamp those frightened sailors kept burning through the darkest nights of their voyage, low near the deck, just enough light to find their way home safely, without giving away their position to the storms and dangers around them. I think that is still the truest image I know for what we have spent this entire night walking through together. Small, stubborn points of light carried forward by ordinary hands through nearly every dark century human beings have ever lived through passed quietly from one generation to the next, usually by people who never once thought of themselves as particularly brave. The lamp is still lit. It always has been somewhere in every single story we told tonight, whether it was a Ragusan council refusing to let a ship dock too soon, or a curate walking door to door with nothing but patience and a notebook, or a scientist boiling needles on his own kitchen stove. And as long as there are people willing to carry it for each other quietly without waiting to be asked, I suspect it always will be long after tonight, long after all of us. Thank you sincerely for spending these hours with me tonight, wherever you are and whatever kind of week brought you here to this quiet little corner of the internet. I hope you found something in this story worth carrying with you into sleep, some small detail that stays with you the way that lamp has stayed with me. I hope more than anything that you rest well tonight, safe, warm, and centuries removed from every single hardship we walk through together this evening. If you enjoyed this journey, I would love to have you back for the next one whenever you are ready for it, whatever story we end up telling together next. Until then, sleep peacefully, close your eyes, and I will see you again very soon.